So you should be members of Rural Vermont. That's your local group that's working for you. Yes, okay. And just a little announcement, some people came by to my booth earlier, and asked for nourishing broth, and we found a box of nourishing broth, so we do have it. Oh. Yeah, so this is nourishing broth, and it's all about bone broth, which we're going to be talking about. Okay. So we were talking about grains, and I want to talk just a little about soy foods, because soy is a grain. It's a seed. It's actually a legume, but it is a seed, and like all seeds, it contains anti-nutrients. The problem with soy is it has very high levels of these anti-nutrients. Some so high that you might call them poisons. And it's very hard to get rid of them in soy. You can't just soak your soybeans overnight. The only way to get rid of them is, at least some of them, is fermentation. Long fermentation. In Asian countries, that's 6 months to 3 years that they ferment the soy. So soy is extremely high in phytic acid. Fermentation will get rid of that. If you want to have a zinc deficiency, just eat a lot of soy. It's also very high in protease inhibitors, which will block your digestion, actually cause swelling of the pancreas, leading to pancreatic cancer. Soy is extremely hard to digest. And we know that for a fact because we work with prisoners. You know, the market for soy foods has gone way down among the general population because of the work we've done and the overall perception that soy is not healthy. So what have they done? They've gotten these contracts with the prisons. And in some of the prisons, 70% of the diet is soy. It is horrendous. And we are in communication with these people. The prison turns a blind eye to all the problems, especially thyroid problems, and unbelievably horrible digestive problems. Soy is very high in isoflavones. These are estrogen-like compounds. These are not eliminated by fermentation. They're in all soy. They do lower cholesterol, but they block thyroid function and they cause endocrine disruption. Our prisoners call it chemical castration. Lectins are very irritating to the gastrointestinal tract, and soy is higher in oxalates than spinach. So you can imagine these people eating very high oxalates. They get stones anywhere from the heart to the kidneys. These oxalate stones, they really are horrible. And finally, soy is very high in manganese, which is a toxin to babies, and it can cause brain damage in the infants on soy formula. And the symptoms of manganese toxicity are identical to the symptoms of autism, a kind of inability to relate on an emotional level. Ironically, soy also causes manganese deficiency. And one of the things I just learned the other day is that your gut bacteria absolutely need manganese. So all these soy foods, particularly the genetically modified soy foods, are really messing up people's gut bacteria. Yeah, no. So I do want to distinguish between the traditional soy foods, which were usually fermented or prepared in a way that lowers the anti-nutrient content and that are consumed in small amounts in Asian cultures in the context of a diet that's extremely supportive of thyroid function. The modern soy foods are heavily processed. We actually eat far more soy foods than they do in the Orient. We eat them in inappropriate ways and in very large amounts. I can't stress enough that soy foods are imitation foods. You cannot make these foods in your kitchen with soybeans. They require all sorts of chemicals and processing and huge machines. And of course, they're packaged to look like the real thing, the thing they're imitating. And every single major dairy corporation in this country has a soy line, a line of soy products, because they own the shelf space. And there's a lot more money to be made from the soy products than the dairy products, so they're really pushing these. And there's this misconception that they eat a lot of soy in Asia, but actually that's not true. The average consumption in Japan is about 2 tablespoons per day. And remember, this is a country where they eat lots and lots of fish and seaweed, and they have good support for the thyroid function. And in China, it's only 2 teaspoons a day. It's basically used as a flavoring or a condiment. In animals, feeding soy has caused infertility, thyroid disease, liver disease in many species of animals. But the position of the soy industry and the scientists who work for the soy industry and the spokespeople and apologists is that it causes these problems in animals but not in people. So I don't buy that. So which will it be, soy milk or real milk? So in the soy milk, you've got synthetic vitamin D, emulsifiers, refined sweeteners, a lot of estrogens, 45 milligrams per cup, which is twice the daily average of the Japanese diet, and all the other anti-nutrients. But where we've really gone wrong is the soy-based infant formula. A report from Switzerland, and this was, I think, about 20 years ago, estimated that a baby on soy formula is receiving the equivalent of 5 to 10 birth control pills a day. And this is in the very vulnerable age for the babies. Very often the little girls develop breasts even under 3 years old. We've actually seen this happen in boys also. We actually had an example of this happening to a boy who was fed raw milk from a cow that was fed soy. And when they went to a cow that wasn't fed soy, it went away. So it comes through in the milk. And in baby boys have a testosterone surge the first 6 months of life, where their testosterone levels are as great as those of an adult male. This programs the boy to express male characteristics at puberty. So what happens when you feed a formula that floods the baby's bloodstream with estrogen-like compounds? We can only guess. Plus all the other anti-nutrients, high levels of manganese, aluminum, and fluoride. It is a witch's brew, and I can't think of a better example of what's wrong with our culture and our society and what will bring us down by the wrath of God than the fact that people are making money feeding soy formula to babies. So we have a lot of resources, a great book, The Whole Soy Story by Kayla Daniel, and please pick up our Soy Alert brochure on our Weston Price table. This is a very non-confrontational way of teaching people about soy. Just hand them the brochure. And then we have a huge section on our website about soy with lots and lots of references. Okay, let's talk about fats. Fats and oils. You thought I'd never get there, right? How much fat should we eat? There's no easy answer to this question. We've seen a great range of fat consumption, anywhere from 30% to 80% of calories in the diets. But always the foods they were eating were high in fat-soluble vitamins. So they got their fat-soluble vitamins. Personally, I'm one of these people that needs a lot of fat in my diet. I suffered from hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, for all my young adult life, and it was only till I figured out that if I eat a very high fat diet, I don't have hypoglycemia. My blood sugar is stable. But some people, in fact, I talked to someone today who have a lot of trouble digesting fats, and that amount of fat would make them very ill. So there's a range. We don't say this is how much you should eat, but you have this range. However, one thing that is pretty consistent across all these diets is that only 4% of calories come from polyunsaturated fatty acids. So let's define our terms now. Saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature. Butter, meat fat, coconut oil. Remember that they're not solid in your body. Your body is not room temperature, right? Your body's tropical, 98 degrees. So this argument that they're going to clog your arteries like pipes because, no, your body's not at room temperature. The monounsaturated oils, such as olive oil, which we recommend, but also canola oil, which we don't recommend, are liquid at room temperature, but if you put them in the fridge, they'll become pretty solid, semi-solid. And finally, the polyunsaturated oils are liquid even in the refrigerator. So that's how you know they're a polyunsaturated oil. So here's what they look like. So this is what a saturated fat molecule looks like, or what they call a saturated fatty acid. It's a straight molecule, and they pack together easily, so that's why they're solid at room temperature. The monounsaturates have a little kink. They have one double bond, that's the mono. And so they don't pack together as easily. They do when they're cold, but when they're room temperature, they don't pack together, so they're liquid. This is what the polyunsaturates look like. They have 2 or more of these little bends or kinks, 2 or more double bonds. This is the one called omega-6. And this is the one called omega-3. We call these essential fatty acids because your body can't make them, has to get them from food. Your body can make these if you don't eat enough of them, because your body really needs these. But the key point here is that these polyunsaturates, with all these twists and turns, are very unstable. They can lose these electrons sticking out, and when they lose an electron, they're left with an unpaired electron, and that is called a free radical. And it's not cholesterol, it's not saturated fat that cause damage in the body. It's free radicals, because they're very reactive, and you get all these uncontrolled reactions in your body, something called oxidation. So that's the key point. The saturated fat and even the monounsaturated fats are stable. They don't break down. They don't break down into free radicals. They last a long time, and you can cook with them safely. This is how these liquid oils are made. It's a huge process that takes place in basically an oil refinery that involves caustic chemicals, lots of heat, just horrendous processing. And what comes out, there's a deodorizing process because these stink. There's a degumming process. There's a bleaching process. The oils, when they come out, are actually white, but they add a little yellow color to remind you of butter. And this is what people buy in the store. It looks clean, smells clean, but they're loaded with toxic breakdown products. And then you're told to cook with these oils, which is even worse.
The doctor just came out with a book on high-fat diet and how healthy it is. He says never cook with extra virgin olive oil. Use just virgin olive oil, which is unavailable in any store.
Well, I don't know about that. I think it's best to cook in animal fats, saturated fats. But you definitely do not want to cook in these. But that's what most people do. So I think of these free radicals as like knives sticking out. They just do a lot of damage. And here is a picture of a healthy artery. This is a coronary artery. It's nice and smooth, pink, well nourished. By the way, you find a lot of fat in the heart. It's always saturated fat, whether that's a vegetarian cow or an omnivore human being. You always have a lot of saturated fat there because that's the kind of fat that your heart needs. It's the fat with the most energy, and it's the fat that's the most stable. This is a damaged artery. It looks like fried chicken. And that damage is done by these little knives sticking out, the free radicals. They damage, and then basically what you're seeing here is a lot of scar tissue. So there's a lot of research on polyunsaturated oils. They're first and foremost highly carcinogenic. They cause cancer. They cause increased heart disease. They are aging. They cause wrinkles. They disrupt the immune system. They cause liver damage. I mean, they're very damaging to the reproductive organs and the lungs. I could go on and on. They make digestion difficult, and we're very concerned with what these do to growing children. They depress learning ability, impair growth. This has been in the literature for 60 years. But of course, we're made to feel very afraid of saturated fat. They're blamed for everything from clogged arteries to diabetes to MS. And just none of this is true. It's junk science. It's absolutely not true. In fact, saturated fat is critical for many processes in the body. Your cell membranes, every cell in your body has a membrane around it made of fatty acids, of which 50% need to be saturated. We need saturated fats for our bones, our heart. They protect heart function. They protect the liver from alcohol and other poisons like Tylenol. Your lungs cannot function without saturated fat. The lung surfactant, which is a soap-like substance in your lungs that allows carbon dioxide and oxygen to pass back and forth, it's made of the molecules there are made of two saturated fatty acids, two saturated fat molecules. And if they are, if you eat a lot of polyunsaturates, these will break. And if you eat a lot of trans fats, which we'll talk about in a moment, the air can't get back and forth. So you absolutely need saturated fats for your lungs to function. And there's not one lung specialist in 10,000 in this country who understands that or knows that. The kidneys can't function without saturated fat. The immune system is supported and enhanced by saturated fat. These essential fatty acids that we looked at, omega-3 and omega-6, they actually don't work without saturated fats in your body. And saturated fats actually support the body's detoxification mechanisms. Well, doesn't saturated fat cause heart disease? We'll talk about that later, but this is just one graph from Europe. These are the countries with low rates of saturated fat consumption and varying rates of heart disease. These are the countries with the highest rates of saturated fat consumption, and you see they have the lowest rates of heart disease. This is France. This is called the French paradox. A lot of saturated fat in the diet, low rates of heart disease. But there's also the Swiss paradox, the Dutch paradox, the Icelandic, Belgian, Finnish, and Austrian paradoxes. With all these paradoxes, maybe there's something wrong with the theory. And yet I was talking to someone the other day in France, and she said they are pushing vegetable oils and statin drugs like nobody's business, like the French paradox never existed. So in the primitive diet, about 4% of calories were polyunsaturated fatty acids, essential fatty acids, and these were in the food they ate, not in these oils. And when these molecules are in the food, they're largely protected from rancidity. Here we have the modern diet, 20%, and usually as very rancid vegetable oils. So you don't have to use these awful oils to get your essential fatty acids. They're in all of the foods that we eat. Now, the industry has a problem with these liquid oils because it needs a more stable, saturated type of fat for baking, for cookies, to get things crisp, and also for frying. So they do a process called partial hydrogenation, which I'm sure you've heard about. Let's just go over this. They start with the cheapest oils, extracted at very high temperatures and pressure, and then they use hexane, which is basically gasoline. They flood the kind of sludge with this to get the last little bit of oil out. So now you have a very rancid oil, which is steam cleaned, and that gets rid of all the vitamins, all the antioxidants, but the pesticides and solvents are still there. The oils are mixed with nickel powder, finely powdered nickel, and they're put into a reactor. Now the reactor will be as big as this room. Can you imagine a room this big filled with vegetable oil and powdered nickel? Okay, and they then heat it, and they flood it with hydrogen. And what happens is that, well, what goes in is a liquid oil, and what comes out is a kind of semi-solid. It looks like gray cottage cheese. And it absolutely stinks to high heaven. So then they steam clean it first they put in emulsifiers to kind of get out the lumps. Then they steam clean it to remove the horrible odor. And then they bleach it to get rid of the gray color. This is called a miracle of science, all right? And at this point, what you have is called pure vegetable shortening. And this is what's used in the fryers and still in quite a few baked goods, although they have gotten a lot of them out of the food supply. They're still there in many foods. Now, to get margarines and spreads, they add artificial flavors, synthetic vitamins. They're not allowed to add a artificial color. They have to add a natural color. It's very comforting. And then, and then it's packaged in blocks and tubs, and because this stuff is so cheap to make, they have a lot of money left over for advertising, and the advertising is so subtle and clever. They basically buy university research departments and get them to do the advertising for them. No, they will not let you in these factories. In fact, I know of a film crew who did a story on this, and they had to go back to tape from the Second World War to show the inside of one of these factories. They will not let you in the factories. So just to show you what happens when they make a trans fat. This is the stearic acid, the natural saturated fat, straight molecule packs together, easily solid at room temperature. This is your oleic acid that doesn't pack together as easily, and it's got a little bend in there. You notice that the hydrogens are in pairs, and that's what your body wants. The pairs are these electron clouds. They're both stable and reactive. They're stable, they don't break down, but then in your body, they react at the right time in the right place, controlled reactions. And even though you're missing 2 hydrogens in the oleic acid, the 2 remaining ones are on the same side. So you still have that electron cloud. In the process of partial hydrogenation, the process that we just described, one of these hydrogens is moved to the other side. It's moved across. Trans means across. That's what a trans fat is. And that kind of makes things balanced, and it straightens out the molecule, and it makes it stable. But it makes it too stable because you don't have your electron cloud here. So when the body does want to have a reaction there, it can't happen. So what I like to say, I know this is a lot of chemistry, but just think of it this way. The liquid polyunsaturated oils cause uncontrolled reactions in the body. They're very unstable. They're like knives going around, okay? The partially hydrogenated oils, the solid fats, inhibit reactions in the body. They inhibit receptors. They inhibit enzymes. They inhibit the formation of hormones. They inhibit vitamins from working. And so basically, if you're eating a lot of these industrial fats and oils, you end up with biochemical chaos in your cells. And who knows what the result will be. For one person, it might be fibromyalgia, and for another person, it might be MS. We have no idea what the final result will be for each person. Excuse me. I hope there's no more in there. So just as the liquid oils have all sorts of terrible side effects, so do the trans fats, and this we know even at very small amounts. They cause heart disease, cancer, degeneration of the joints and tendons. This is why people need all these hip replacements, elbow replacements. They contribute to osteoporosis and diabetes, autoimmune diseases. Guys, they lower testosterone, lower sperm count, and then in children, they result in failure to grow, learning disabilities, low birth weight. You know, our hospitals are, these preemie wards are full. And they're huge income producers for the hospitals. You know, a premature baby will cost $1 million. It's horrendous. And then even if mom is eating just a little bit of hydrogenated fats while she's pregnant or nursing, it can cause reduced visual acuity in the babies. And she'll also have reduced fat content in her milk. Her milk will not be as nourishing. And there will be trans fats in her milk too. Finally, our government has admitted that trans fats are bad, and what they say, the way they put this, their spin on it is, trans fats are bad, they're just as bad as saturated fats. And they used when they finally had to say trans fats are bad, they used it as a way to bash saturated fats even more. And the truth is that the saturated fats have the opposite reaction from the trans. So, for example, the trans interfere with hormone production, whereas the saturated fats enhance and support hormone production. The trans, inhibit insulin receptors, and the saturated fats help the insulin receptors. So the saturated fats have good results, and the trans fats are bad. Just a few recent studies, because now you can't have full-fat milk in the schools because it's supposed to make the children fat. They can only have low reduced fat milk. A Swedish study found that children on low-fat diets ended up fatter, consumed more sugar, and had higher insulin resistance. And children on drinking reduced fat milk had greater weight gain. Full-fat milk is associated with fertility. A study found that women on low-fat dairy products had trouble getting pregnant. It was a very embarrassing study for these people, and the way they put their spin on it was, well, if you're having trouble getting pregnant, switch to full-fat milk and eat some cheese, and as soon as you get pregnant, you can go back to your low-fat diet. It's incredible, really. I mean, don't you think that the kind of diet that would get you pregnant is the kind of diet you need when you're pregnant? And finally, my favorite study. Swedish women using cheese and full-fat dairy had lower weight gain as they grew older. Now, notice it does not say no weight gain. Okay? It says lower weight gain. It is normal and healthy for women to gain weight as they grow older. So, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If you can still wear your prom dress when you're 50 years old, you are too thin. Okay? Women trying to be so slim when they get older. I mean, if you're naturally that way, that's fine. But it's normal to gain a couple of dress sizes as you grow older. Of course, you don't want to gain too much. So stick to your full-fat dairy products, and you'll be just the right weight. That weight gain translates into better bone health, more strength, fewer wrinkles. I mean, you look younger when you let yourself gain a little bit of weight. So. Also, as my husband says, they take you more seriously if you let yourself gain a little weight. This was what came out when they said the trans were bad, and this is from the American Heart Association. Bad fat brothers saturated in trans. And this was from the World Heart Federation, an advertisement showing that butter equated to razor blades. So this is what they do. The vegetable oil companies set up these non-profits that look like they're helping people, and that's the way they do their advertising. And this one, open your eyes to saturated fat, implying that cheese, nature's most perfect food, is going to kill you. So this is why we have the number one reason. I know there's a lot of bad things in our food supply. Sugar's one of them, additives, but number one is all of these fake butter-like spreads and margarines. And just only a couple of feet here for butter, and all the rest is margarines and spreads. So I could go on and on about fats, but let's just summarize here. These are the bad fats, okay? Margarines, spreads, all of the commercial salad dressings. Read the labels on these salad dressings. They're just total garbage. The cooking oils, the hardened oils like Crisco, and then all these products that contain them. Cool Whip, Miracle Whip, most of the mayonnaises. And then the foods that they're in. They're in all processed foods, crackers and chips, and, a hungry teenage boy can eat a huge bag of these in the afternoon after his horrible low-fat, FDA-approved school lunch. He's hungry. Is anyone explaining to these boys that the fats that they're using in these chips might prevent him from having a normal sex life? Garrison Keillor says, when you turn 13, sex replaces Christmas as a thing you look forward to in life. So you want it to be good, you know? And then the French fries. Now, McDonald's used to use lamb tallow for the French fries, and they were delicious. I actually do remember these French fries. They changed in the 1980s to partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. And now they're using just liquid oils, which is worse, even worse than the trans fats. These are cancer sticks. And, of course, all the bottled dressings. Make your own dressing. And there's 36 recipes for healthy salad dressing and nourishing traditions based on olive oil. They take a minute to make. So. Yeah, right. So these are the 6 basic good fats and oils. This is what you should have in your kitchen. Pastured butter, extra virgin olive oil so you can make your own salad dressing, pastured lard, coconut oil, cod liver oil, a natural cod liver oil, and I've added, I don't have it in the text, but I just added duck fat or goose fat, and the reason I did that was because our recent tests showed that this is a great source of vitamin K, and it's a great fat for cooking. And don't be afraid of butter. So many wonderful things in butter. I often say, butter is the fat in nature designed for growth, for all animals. And all children should get butter, of course, but adults need butter too. Okay, the 8th principle, we talk a little bit about omega-6 and omega-3. Now these are both essential fatty acids. This is something that's kind of out there. You need a balance between the two. But we're getting mostly omega-6 in our diets today because all of these vegetable oils are omega-6. The primitive diet, about 4% of calories was polyunsaturates, and it was a nice balance between omega-3 and omega-6. But this is what the modern diet looks like. And so it's like 19 or 20 to 1. I'm sorry. Lecithin? Yeah, it's a natural lecithin, which is very good for helping all the fats and cholesterol in your bloodstream do what they want to do. Yeah. And one of the reasons for this discrepancy is the way we've changed our agriculture. Chickens that are raised outdoors, fed fish meal or get insects, they'll have this nice balance. And this is what the commercial eggs look like. Far more omega-6 and omega-3. This is what wild salmon looks like. And this is what commercial salmon looks like. This is what organic spinach looks like. And this is what conventional spinach looks like. Again, I just wrote an article on this. It's on my blog, nourishingtraditions.com, explaining the omega-6 and omega-3 business. So this is an easy one to fix, to get your balance back between omega-6 and omega-3. One is you get rid of all those vegetable oils because they're mostly omega-6. You can put a little bit of flax oil in your salad dressings to get some omega-3s, and I really have to emphasize a small amount. People are overdosing on flax oil, and now they're getting too much omega-3, and that's just as bad as getting too much omega-6. And then choose organic and pasture-fed animal and plant foods for a good source of omega-3 fatty acids. This one's quite easy. 9th principle, all traditional diets contain some salt. And here's another area, we're told not to eat salt, but salt is essential to life. And they ate sea salt, or they got salt from salt flats. The Aboriginals, for example, traded salt all over Australia that they got from the salt flats. In parts of Africa, they put the ashes of sodium-rich marsh grasses into their food. Meat and milk products concentrate salt, and some cultures used the blood and urine of their animals to get salt. We do need more salt with cooked foods because it is an enzyme activator. Why salt? Why do we need salt? Why do we have a salt taste bud in our mouth? Because we're supposed to put salt on our food. Salt is our source of chloride. It's really the only source of chloride in the diet. And we need chloride to make hydrochloric acid. So without salt, you cannot digest protein. And in fact, I've had practitioners tell me that they've seen a lot of parasites in people on low salt diets because they're not making hydrochloric acid and the parasites get by. That's our kind of gate there to keep the parasites out. Also, the sodium in salt activates enzymes that we need for carbohydrate digestion. So the Creator did not put a salt taste bud in your mouth to torture you, but to make you put salt on your food. Salt is critical for the development of the brain. It supports adrenal function. If you're under a lot of stress, you need more salt. And it's basically the basis of cellular metabolism, of having a different chemistry on the inside and the outside of the cell so you can have the electrical differences there that you need. Oh, so much brainwashing. Salt, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, we've got to save the Social Security system, right? So, okay, so we figured out how to ruin our salt, just like we figured out how to ruin everything else with processing. Although, let me just say this, that even processed salts, this is one area where we're actually so much better off than people, let's say, 400 or 500 years ago, where they didn't have a lot of salt. This is how the rulers controlled their population, by giving or withholding salt, because you absolutely need salt. So the traditional salt production was just evaporation of seawater, which was rich in, so it was rich in magnesium, about 10% magnesium, and all the trace minerals from the sea. But we take all of those out when we refine our salt, and we add an aluminum-based additive so it pours when it rains. Okay. Right? Don't you remember going to your grandmother's house and you had little salt bowls, little salt spoons? Does anyone remember that? Yeah, that's before they refined the salt. So your salt should be gray, beige, or pink, not white. So that indicates the presence of minerals in the salt. How much? The adult requirement is 1.5 teaspoons a day. You absolutely need 1.5 teaspoons of salt per day, and that's just about what Americans are eating today. We're not over-consuming salt. The government wants us to cut that in half, which will and use artificial salt chemicals that taste like salt but are not salt, and I can guarantee you this will cause raving in the streets. It will cause incredible health problems and mental disorders. And our salt consumption in 1900 was 3 teaspoons a day. It was much higher. So we don't eat nearly as much salt as we used to. And there's no need to cut back. 10th principle, all traditional cultures made use of bones, usually as a nourishing bone broth. And I know a book about this. Nourishing broth. So, broth contains calcium and other minerals in a form easy to assimilate, although less calcium than we thought. We thought we'd find a lot more, but there is some calcium there. It supplies the nutrients that help build healthy cartilage, healthy collagen. The amino acids in broth help the body detoxify. The gelatin in broth helps digestion. For reasons not entirely understood, broth is very healing to the digestive tract. And broth regulates dopamine. Dopamine is a very important feel-good chemical. If we don't have enough, we're sluggish and can't get moving. If we have too much, we're kind of hyper and can't concentrate. So we want that dopamine to be right there in the middle. And broth will do that. It will regulate that. So, you know what raises dopamine really well? Chocolate. And that's why it gets to be addictive. And the problem with chocolate is it can have some very serious side effects. One of the side effects of chocolate is rage. Have you ever heard of chocolate rage? Some people get just uncontrollably angry after they eat chocolate. So that's just the dopamine not being regulated, going up and down. So learn to make broth. Here we're making broth with a whole chicken. And by the way, there's a lot of good stuff in gelatin in the skin. And you see the chicken feet there. If you can get the feet, please use them. I saw the most amazing thing a couple weeks ago. They were selling chicken feet in our local supermarket. I'd never seen that before. I wonder where they got that idea. Anyway, so use some vegetables, a little vinegar, You bring that to a simmer. Always skim any scum that comes to the top. If you're using a real pastured chicken, you won't have any scum. But if you're using a regular chicken, you're going to have a lot of it. So you need to take that off. That's all the impurities. And then you simmer that anywhere from 4 hours to overnight. You can use a crock pot. In fact, they're fantastic for making chicken broth. And I love this South American saying, good broth resurrects the dead. And we've had lots of people brought back to life with broth. Oh, my goodness. So there's some chicken heads here. My daughter took this photograph in the Himalayas. She was trekking in the Himalayas, and they were selling these chicken heads at the market, and they were being snapped up by all these wonderful Buddhist, so supposedly vegetarian people. And what were they using the chicken heads for? They were making soup, because there's a lot of good gelatin in the chicken heads. This is what they call in French cooking a reduction. We started with a couple quarts of beef broth, and we just boil, and it gets thick and flavorful. It's naturally thickened by the gelatin, and this is the basis for all the gourmet sauces. And you can add things, cream, butter, wine, herbs, whatever. But when you put this on your meat, you're really pretty much eating the whole animal, the flesh and the bones. And it will actually help you digest that meat. It provides a great balance to the meat. Plus, it tastes so good. So there's the book. Unfortunately, the industry has figured out how to imitate the taste of broth using MSG. And here's an example of the many products that have MSG in them. I gave this talk to a group of Southern ladies, and I put the Old Bay seasoning there, and nobody was happy about that. It didn't go over very well. But MSG, as we know, is linked to so many diseases: diabetes, migraines, headaches, obesity. Now, isn't that interesting? If you don't believe me, go to Medline and look up MSG-induced obesity. It's very hard to get laboratory animals, to become obese so they can study obesity. So they make them obese by feeding them MSG, and that makes them obese. It's linked to autism, ADHD, and Alzheimer's. And sometimes it's called monosodium glutamate or MSG, but usually they disguise it with another name like hydrolyzed protein, extracts, caseinates, anything autolyzed. All of these textured soy products are loaded with MSG. It's even found in corn oil. So it's usually not on the label. And I highly recommend this book, Excitotoxins by Russell Blaylock. This is just one diagram from his book showing how if it gets past the blood-brain barrier, it destroys brain cells. Now, glutamic acid is an essential amino acid that we actually need. It's very important, but the MSG works a little differently and stimulates these nerves in a way that's very unhealthy. Anyone here ever get tired? So here's my formula for fatigue. And I had chronic fatigue when I was in my 20s. And it disappeared over the years as I added all these things. So raw dairy, not pasteurized, easy to digest. Proper preparation of grains, so you pre-digest the grains, so your body is not expending a lot of energy trying to digest something it actually can't digest. Lacto-fermented foods rich in enzymes and beneficial bacteria, and the gelatin-rich bone broths. All of these support your digestion, and the older you get, the more you need that support. It's the Chinese medicine would say you lose your digestive fire as you get older. So you need more and more support of these types of food as you get older. And less energy required for digestion, the more energy there will be for you. And I guarantee you, you'll find if you put these principles in practice, you will have more energy. And not manic energy, but just steady energy all day long. You should never feel tired during the day. You should have plenty of energy for all the things you want to do. And then finally at night, you feel sleepy. You don't feel tired, you feel sleepy. And you should go to bed and fall asleep immediately. That's health. That's real health. 11th principle, traditional cultures made provisions for future generations. We've talked about this already. They fed special foods for parents-to-be, pregnant women, nursing women, and growing children. These were the sacred foods so rich in the fat-soluble activators A, D, and K. Another fascinating practice was the spacing of children. Throughout the South Seas and Africa, it was considered shameful to have a child more than once every 3 years. And this practice is totally supported by the science. We know that the ideal spacing for the prevention of birth defects is 3 years, and also the ideal spacing for the emotional development of the child is 3 years. So we put a lot of emphasis on waiting. After you had your first child, you wait a little over 2 years before you get pregnant again, so you can build up your nutritional stores. And that way, every child in your family will have the benefit of this good nutrition. I'll tell you one thing that does is cut down on jealousy, all right? Because every child is started off with the same deck of cards, so to speak, with a really good hand. And finally, the principles of proper diet were taught to the young, and this was one of the roles of the elders. These were like war secrets in these tribes. These were survival secrets that they had to know if they were going to survive generation after generation. This woman has walked many miles to obtain a special food for the baby growing in her womb. It is a type of crab, and she will eat that whole crab, including the yellow parts and the organs. And she takes the shells and grinds them up and adds them to her food. And when Dr. Price asked about this, they said, this is what we eat when we're pregnant so we can have healthy babies. Our American Beauty here, we have her sister, who's a lovely girl, but she was born only 15 months later. Their diet had not been quite as good during that time, and she has a slightly more narrow face and a little bit of crowding in the teeth. And this is the pattern that you saw in families up to the Second World War. If it was a family on a dairy farm, the first 3 or 4 children would have the broad face and the straight teeth. And then you saw the narrowing as it went down. Today we're seeing the very narrow face in the first child in every family because the women are not nutritionally replete and prepared for pregnancy. This is the 3rd and 4th child in an American family. They were not locked in a closet. They had a normal social life and were allowed to go to friends' houses where they did get some junk food, but they were highly protected by their diet at home. They got their cod liver oil, lots of butter, and they were spaced. Every child in this family was at least 3 years apart. So it's a formula, and we can all do this. It's actually not that hard if you know what you're doing. So Dr. Price's dying words were, you teach, you teach, you teach. The people that he studied knew these things by instinct. It was just part of their tradition. They weren't scientific thinkers. They knew it by connection to the spiritual world. And we've lost that connection. We have to know these things by science. We have to know them by teaching. There's no other way we can do this than to teach. People can't figure this out just by connecting. We have to teach. So that's why we set up the Weston A. Price Foundation. We are a teaching organization. We publish a quarterly magazine full of the latest in nutritional science, but also a lot of practical things in our magazine. We bridge the gap between the layman and the scientist. We have a lot of educational brochures. Please pick them up. They're free. We publish a yearly shopping guide. We have an annual conference. This year it's in Montgomery, Alabama. And don't think that's too far away. 70% of our people fly in to the conference, so we hope you'll come. And then we have our local chapter system that helps you find the foods that we're recommending in your area. And then we have Paul here. He's a local chapter. He's one of our oldest local chapters. And I mean, you've been there the longest. I don't mean that you're old, but I mean, you want to stand up, Paul? Doug, I'm sorry, Doug. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Got a U in it. Okay, and it's 4-letter. And any other chapter leaders here? Okay, and where is your chapter? Okay. Yeah, we have 7 or 8 Vermont chapter leaders, so that's big. So if you're looking for, and each chapter leader keeps a food list of what's available in the area, and many of them also do events like potlucks, and if they're not doing events, maybe you can help them do events. We have a huge website. If you're new to our website, do take a tour on the right-hand side. We publish our shopping guide every year, and now we have it as an app. And we have this neat little Healthy for Life cookbook with our basic principles in it. And I don't know if Kathy's here, but I think we will give you one free as long as they last if you sign up to be a member today. As long as they last. And even if we run out, please do become a member. And we have special issues, our healthy baby issue and our heart disease issue. And then I'm here with New Trends Publishing, my books from New Trends, and that includes my new baby and child care book and the Nourishing Traditions cookbook for children. So they're here. And my DVD series. And the Nourishing Traditions DVD is the long version of this. That's the 6-hour version. Dr. Price's work you can get on Amazon or from the Price Pottinger Nutrition Foundation. Okay, last slide, well, second to last slide. In summary, everything they did in traditional diets was designed to make the food more nutritious, more digestible, more nutrient dense, from the food choices, animal fats, organ meats rather than muscle meats, etc., to the way they cooked, to everything they did. Everything we do in the modern diet is designed to make food more convenient, more industrial, and that depletes the nutrients in the food. Diet is not 100% of the equation. Some of us need other modalities. Maybe it's herbs, maybe it's homeopathics, maybe it's conventional. I'm not saying that we don't sometimes need an operation or something like that. But all of these require the food first, and they are not going to work for you unless you get on a nutrient-dense diet. So that's really the summary to maximize the nutrients in your food, maximize the availability of the nutrients in your food. A final summary, and many of you asked for this. If you go here, this is under chapter resources. All of these slide presentations that I do are there with a lot of the notes, and you can download them, you can give them yourself, you can use them. There's no copyright on them. And I hope you do. We need a big army of people teaching this. You teach, you teach, you teach. So thank you for being here, and thank you for all the work that you're going to be doing in the future. Thank you. Thank you. All right, now we're going to talk about probably the biggest stumbling block or hurdle that people need to get over if they want to adopt this diet, and that is, what about heart disease? What about cholesterol? So that's what we're going to explore in this next hour. Now let's reason together here, okay? According to the diet dictocrats, and these are the self-appointed health watchdogs in the medical industry and the government. According to the diet dictocrats, the reason we have so much heart disease today compared to 100 years ago is because we've become a spoiled, rich, indulgent people, and we're eating a lot of cholesterol and these terrible saturated animal fats, and that we didn't used to do so. And so back in the old days, we weren't eating this rich, indulgent diet, and we didn't have heart disease, cancer, and the other diseases that we have today. Okay, so you know that. So what I want to do is go back 100 years and look at how Americans were actually eating at the time. Actually, we're going back 120 years. I have a cookbook published in 1895, put together by the Baptist Ladies of Monmouth, Illinois. So they put this book together for their church as a fundraiser for their church, And we know that this is how they were eating because these are their recipes. Now, this collection of recipes from the turn of the century is very interesting because it completely flies in the face of what the establishment is telling us. That the reason we have so much cancer and heart disease today compared to a century ago is because we are eating greater amounts and greater levels of saturated fats from animal foods. So let's open up this little cookbook. There's hardly a recipe in this book that does not contain butter, eggs, cream, or lard, beginning with the soup chapter and ending with the substantial array of desserts. Most meat recipes call for gravy made with the drippings. The drippings were not thrown away. They were made into gravy, and occasionally that gravy had added cream. Lean roasts were larded to give them fat. Now, one of the interesting things about this cookbook, it seems that in 1895, nobody had heard of al dente or lightly steamed vegetables. All the vegetables in the recipes are cooked a long time, and most of them call for a sauce. In fact, the vegetables seem to be just an excuse for a sauce. The vegetable recipes include asparagus dressed in cream, 4 versions of cabbage with cream sauce, corn and eggplant fritters fried in lard, potato balls fried in good drippings, and parsnips fried in bacon fat. One of the things that visitors to America noted in the 1700s and 1800s was that Americans were a butter-eating nation. We ate huge amounts of butter compared to Europeans. Observers stated that in America everything was swimming in butter, including porridge, soup, meat, vegetables, and pudding. We were a very rich land. We were a dairy nation. We ate lots and lots of butter. It tasted good, and nobody but a few kooks were around to tell us it was sinful to eat butter. Seafood recipes in this little book from 1895 include fish a la creme, scalloped fish, creamed salmon, and creamed fish. The sauce for broiled fish calls for 1 large spoonful of butter and 1 1/2 cups of cream. 1 1/2 cups of cream. Mm-hmm. Now, the Baptist Ladies Cookbook contains a whole chapter devoted to oysters. Americans ate 2 to 3 times as many oysters per person in those days compared to today. Usually they were canned oysters from the Chesapeake Bay, but there were also some fresh oysters coming into on the trains to Chicago. Recipes for oysters include deviled oysters made with egg yolks, creamed oyster patties made with eggs and butter, oysters wrapped in bacon, scalloped oysters, oyster pie made with 1 quart of cream. Oyster fritters fried in drippings, oysters fried in hot lard, and scalloped oysters made with butter and whole milk. There's a chapter on organ meats that includes fried veal liver and sweetbreads, both creamed and fried. There's a scrapple recipe, and scrapples made out of the organ meats, the scraps after you butcher. It calls for hog's head, heart, tongue, and part of the liver. This is stored in a crock and covered with melted lard. And then it was consumed for breakfast, sliced and fried in lard. And there's separate chapters for eggs and cheese. Well, let's look at the salad recipes in this book. There's only one salad recipe that calls for lettuce when available. Lettuce is a modern luxury, and in the past, people only had lettuce during certain periods of the year. And this leads me to my own particular theory about the cause of heart disease. It's caused by lettuce. Well, why not? I mean, it just makes so much sense. In those days, we didn't eat much lettuce. We had little heart disease. And today, we eat a lot of lettuce. We have lots of heart disease. Right? I mean, that's the kind of logic that's being used here. But actually, I have a very good explanation for why heart disease is caused by lettuce. And we'll come to that at the end of my lecture. The other salad recipes feature apples, cabbage, ham, tongue, chicken, oyster, fruit, potato, veal, lobster, sweetbreads, shrimp, and nasturtium. So salads were just cold dishes, okay? Now, what kind of dressing were they put on their salads? The dressing for coleslaw features sweet cream, and 3 recipes for salad dressing contain egg yolk, mustard, and vinegar. So they were using egg yolk for the fat. One recipe calls for olive oil or melted butter. Can you imagine that? If you didn't have olive oil, you used melted butter. If they did, and of course they probably didn't have olive oil in Illinois in those days. There's another recipe that calls for 1 cup of whipped cream. Actually, there is one salad dressing recipe that calls for oil, and this is the only time in this whole book we see this word oil without any qualifiers. And this is, the vegetable oils were just starting to come in to this area, into the stores. Americans at the turn of the century nourished themselves with butter, cream, egg yolks, and lard. They did not use vegetable oil. Some Italian communities may have used olive oil. Cottonseed oil was just beginning to emerge into the food supply. But basically, Americans used animal fats, even on salads. In addition to eggs, butter, cream, lard, suet, which is beef fat, and other animal fats like chicken and duck fat, coconut meat, and coconut oil supplied additional saturated fats in turn-of-the-century diets. Highly saturated coconut oil was used in crackers and baked goods. Now, the Baptists were fond of rich desserts. Half the book is devoted to cakes, pies, ice creams, pudding, and donuts. And the donuts were fried in lard, of course. 2 advertisements for dentists in the back of the book testify to the effect of sugar and white flour on their teeth. But cancer and heart disease were extremely rare before the turn of the century. People were sturdy and strong, but obesity was not a problem. Today, however, we're being told that saturated fats from animal sources and from the tropical oils are the cause of cancer, heart disease, and obesity. What we're going to do in this presentation is focus on how this great change came about. How it was that Americans traded animal fats for vegetable oils in everything from baked goods to baby foods. And the title of this tall tale is The Oiling of America. Okay, and we're going to fast forward now to 1921. And this was the date of the first recorded myocardial infarction in the United States. Myocardial infarctions means a heart disease, a heart attack, excuse me. Up to that point, we did have some heart disease in America, usually congestive heart failure. It was a chronic disease, a slow decline, often as the aftermath of a bad case of typhoid fever. But sudden death in seemingly healthy people from a heart attack, that was new. By 1930, there were 3,000 deaths per year from myocardial infarction, and by 1960, there were 500,000. So obviously something was going on here, and people were asking why. Now, one explanation that came forward was put forward actually by the dietitians, who were a pretty good group of people back in those days. And they said, look, the consumption of animal fats is going down, and the consumption of these new vegetable oils is going up. And it makes sense that this is where we should be looking for the cause of this new disease. Oh, let me just jump one more thing. 1913 was the publication of the story of Crisco, which is a cookbook that had Crisco in every recipe. There was a recipe for a lobster bisque with 1 cup of Crisco in it. And they claimed that women who used Crisco rather than lard were more modern, more enlightened, had cleaner houses, and had children of better character. I mean, they pushed all the buttons in the upwardly mobile Americans, okay? They created the impression that it was somehow vulgar, lower class, lack of education, not scientific, to cook with lard, that only, trashy people cooked with lard, right? Okay. Anyway, we had this theory that we should be looking at the new vegetable oils, but another group came out with a different theory. And this is called the diet heart theory, or the lipid hypothesis. And that was that we were eating a bad diet, and this diet had too much cholesterol and saturated fat from foods like butter and lard. And these foods caused us to have high levels of cholesterol in the blood, And the high levels of cholesterol in the blood led to atherosclerosis, the buildup of plaque in the arteries, and that's what led to coronary heart disease. So the overarching conclusion was that this bad diet was causing the new epidemic, especially of myocardial infarction or heart attack. Now, when you're a scientist and you come up with a theory, the burden of proof is on you. And if something comes along that contradicts that theory, you need to go back to the drawing board and come up with something else. And as a matter of fact, there was a contradictory study as early as 1936. Now remember, the first myocardial infarction was recorded in 1921, so this is only a few years later. This was carried out by cardiologists at Harvard University. People who died sudden death, they did an autopsy, and they looked at levels of cholesterol in the blood and the amount of fat in the coronary artery, amount of blockage, and they found no correlation. There were people with low levels of cholesterol and high levels of blockage, and there were people with high levels of cholesterol and low levels of blockage. So this is called a scatter graph. There's no trend or anything that you can conclude from this graph. And basically, there is no relationship between cholesterol levels and atherosclerosis. So very early, this portion of the theory was disproven. People with high cholesterol don't necessarily have atherosclerosis. Nevertheless, the theory continued to be promoted, and the next step was the formation of something called the Anti-Coronary Club in New York. Let's see. Oh. Here we go. So the Anti-Coronary Club placed businessmen on what they called the prudent diet. They ate corn oil and margarine instead of butter, cold breakfast cereals instead of eggs, and chicken and fish instead of beef. And then they had a control group of the same age that ate eggs for breakfast and meat 3 times a day. When the results came in, there was a paper published, and there was an abstract, and they said this was very successful. The prudent dieters had average cholesterol levels of 220, and those in the controls 250. So this was very successful in bringing people's cholesterol down. But in the fine print of this paper, you read something quite surprising, that there were 8 deaths from heart disease among the prudent dieters with lower cholesterol and no deaths among the controls with higher cholesterol. So this study did not exactly come out the way they wanted it to. Well, there were critics who said this study was too small, the results were not statistically significant, and what we need is a big million-man study to compare the prudent diet with one high in meat and fat, and they actually started to organize for this, stockpiling all the foods for the prudent diet. See, you can stockpile those foods because they last forever. And they did a little pilot study, which was never published, which showed that the prudent diet was worthless, and the diet heart study was abandoned for reasons of cost. There's just not enough money to do this. Well, the next step was something, here we go. So the next step, we're going to come up now, actually it was just a year before, it was in 1956. The American Heart Association, which was actually founded to promote this theory, they had a fundraiser on all 3 networks at the same time. Can you imagine having that much power? It was on all 3 networks at the same time, and it was a bunch of doctors sitting around promoting the prudent diet, one in which corn oil, margarine, chicken, and cold cereal replaced butter, lard, beef, eggs, and oatmeal with cream. So they were all on television promoting the prudent diet. There was, however, one of the panelists who disagreed, Dr. Paul Dudley White, who is considered the father of modern cardiology, and he was President Eisenhower's physician. And on public television, he noted that heart disease in the form of myocardial infarction was non-existent in 1900, when egg consumption was 3 times what it was in 1956, and when corn oil was unavailable. When pressed to support the prudent diet, Dr. White replied, "See here, I began my practice as a cardiologist in 1921, and I never saw an MI patient till 1928. Back in the MI-free days before 1920, the fats were butter and lard, and I think we would all benefit from the kind of diet that we had at that time when no one had ever heard the word corn oil. The really sad thing is that Dr. White, then they put a lot of pressure on him, and he ended up promoting the prudent diet also. Okay. So that's the end of my notes there. So the question is, we have all of these contradictory studies, the Anti-Coronary Club, the study from Harvard, and there were many others. So why did this keep going? Why were they continuing to promote this? Well, it won't surprise you to learn that in the background was an industry, and it was the very industry that could benefit from the diet heart theory, and that was the edible oil industry. They have a very strong lobbying group in Washington, D.C. that you never hear of. They're very quiet. You don't know they're there. It's called the Institute for Shortening and Edible Oils. And they were working behind the scenes from the beginning. In 1965, the American Heart Association actually published a statement saying that it could be these new trans fats that were causing heart disease. And when Dr. Fred Mattson of Procter & Gamble heard about this, he put a lot of pressure on, and they actually withdrew the document and issued a new one, which encouraged the consumption of partially hydrogenated oils. This industry in the 60s supervised. They worked in the background of the American Heart Association, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and the American Dietetic Association. What that means is that they got their people on the boards. They supervised. They made sure that what they were saying was supportive of their industry and that demonized the competition. Now, in 1971, the FDA's general counsel left the FDA. He became president of this Edible Oil Association. And he was replaced by a food lawyer, Peter Barton Hutt, who had represented the edible oil industry. There was a big lawsuit about allowing trans fats, partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, in peanut butter. And he won that lawsuit. So we called this the revolving door policy. And he went to the FDA, and in a moment you're going to see exactly what he did. And finally, in the 70s and 80s, the same Dr. Mattson held very influential positions in something called the Lipid Research Clinic trials that led to a nationwide propaganda program called the National Cholesterol Education Program. And we'll talk about that as well. Okay. Surprisingly, the American Medical Association was opposed to this theory up until the early 1960s. They said the anti-fat, anti-cholesterol fad is not just foolish and futile, it also carries some risk. And they said this kind of diet could be dangerous to even try. But by the early 1970s, the American Medical Association had come around to this new point of view. And in these years, the three major organizations, the American Heart Association, the American Medical Association, and the National Academy of Science, all issued official statements that probably were written by the same person. They all said the same thing. The first was that Americans had cholesterol levels that were too high. It's just a blanket statement. Everybody has high cholesterol, and we need to measure cholesterol. They called for the simple step of measuring people's cholesterol, even in early adulthood. See, they're going to get you worried about this from a very young age. And then Americans who were in the risk category could receive appropriate dietary advice. They did not define what risk meant, who was in the risk category, but if you were in the risk category, you got this dietary advice, and that was to reduce your intake of saturated fat by substituting polyunsaturated vegetable oils. And then all three of these statements had this kind of bizarre statement, which was, modified and ordinary foods useful for this purpose should be readily available on the market, reasonably priced, and easily identified by appropriate labeling. Any existing legal and regulatory barriers to the marketing of such foods should be removed. And finally, More studies need to be done to determine whether modification of plasma lipids, that means lowering your cholesterol, can reduce heart disease. Oh, this is kind of ironic. They're promoting drastic, radical change to our diet, but also admitting that they don't even know if this is going to work. We need more research. Well, these legal and regulatory barriers to the marketing of such foods should be removed. What were these barriers? Well, the barriers were the provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which said there are certain traditional foods that everyone knows, such as bread, milk, and cheese, and when the consumers buy these foods, they should get the foods they're expecting. If the food resembles a standardized food but does not comply with the standard, that food must be labeled as imitation. This was the barrier. So fake foods had to be labeled imitation foods, and Americans didn't want imitation foods, especially after the Second World War. They wanted real foods. And so the industry, they wanted to get rid of this imitation label because they were figuring out how to make all kinds of imitation foods. And so it was Peter Barton Hutt who went to the FDA who instituted the imitation policy. Now, there was never a vote on this. I don't think even in those days there was ever any input from the public. This imitation policy attempted to provide for advances in food technology. There it is. It's not for you. It's not to make our food healthier or better, but to give manufacturers relief from the dilemma of either complying with an outdated standard or having to label the new products as imitation. Such products are not necessarily inferior to the traditional foods for which they may be substituted. Okay, so they thought they were just as good as real foods, and they defined inferiority as a reduction in content of an essential nutrient that is present at a level of 2% more of the US RDA. So that means you have something like cream, which has calcium and vitamin A at more than 2% of the RDA, the minuscule RDA. And so if you just put some calcium in and some vitamin A into a emulsified vegetable oil product, you don't have to call it imitation. They call it non-dairy creamer, but it doesn't say imitation. And that opened the floodgates to so many of the imitation foods, things like Cool Whip, things like egg beaters, all these imitation foods that didn't have to have the word imitation on them. They were doing a lot with soy foods, so they'd figured out how to make imitation bacon, Bacobits, okay? Didn't have to say imitation on there. As soon as this was done, the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs was convened. It was chaired by George McGovern. It actively promoted the lipid hypothesis. Thousands of pages of dissenting testimony were ignored. The final report claimed that USDA data showed that animal fats cause and vegetable oils prevent heart disease. Now, when this report came out, my colleague Mary Enig was a graduate student at the University of Maryland, and she was very confused because she was familiar with the USDA data. She got their data through Freedom of Information and looked at it, and she found that they had manipulated it in strange ways, such as adding when they should have subtracted, or leaving out chunks of data that would have changed their results. She then published an article in an obscure journal showing what the data actually said, showing that the people still eating animal fats had less cancer and less heart disease, and said that we needed to do more research on the trans fats. And in fact, she was doing research on the trans fats. At that time, believe it or not, the government databases didn't have trans fats in them. Trans fats were just called saturated fats. So when people were doing research using this data and found that people eating a certain way had more cancer, and the databases indicated they were eating more saturated fats, but actually it was more trans fats. So they were going around to various stores buying food and analyzing the amount of trans in them, which the industry did not like at all. Well, Mary's article got a lot of publicity. She was mentioned in every major newspaper of the United States and even in the Inquirer. So about 3 weeks after this article came out, she was called to the University of Maryland to the lipids department, and when she got there, it was all the professors, all the graduate students, so probably about 10 or 12 people, and 4 people from industry. There was someone from Central Soya, from Unilever, from Kraft, and from the Institute for Shortening and Edible Oils. And one of them had a big stack of newspaper clippings. Remember, this is before the internet. And he was shaking with rage. And he said, "We watch the journals that publish nutrition articles to make sure that there's nothing that hurts our industry." What a statement. Basically, they were controlling what went to the public. And he said, "I thought my colleague was watching the journal that published your article, and he thought I was watching that journal, and we let the barn door open and a horse got out." He said, "This will never happen again." Now, he said, "You need to stop the research you're doing right now. If you continue with this research, we'll make sure that you never get another cent of funding." Well, they did continue their research. Fortunately, they published it. Mary published a big, long article, and that information did go into the government databases and eventually led to the ban or the bad publicity on trans fats. But meanwhile, they were true to their word. All of the funding was cut off. As the professors retired, they were not replaced. There was no more funding for graduate students. Even funding from the dairy industry was cut off. So they were very powerful. So in spite of Mary's brave efforts, the report and the accompanying publicity continued American dietary trends to more vegetable oils, less animal fat. But the medical profession was still skeptical of the value of cholesterol-lowering measures. So now there's a big push to get the doctors involved. Now remember that there was not much money to do that big diet heart study that should have been done. But there was plenty of money for other studies. And this money was your money. It was taxpayer money. The first was the 40-year Framingham study, which looked at cardiovascular heart disease events versus levels of cholesterol in the blood. And this was the final graph summarizing everything. And it looks like, especially for men, if you go past a certain level of cholesterol, things get really dangerous for you. The risk goes way, way up. Now, anyone here ever taken statistics? Statistics. Okay. Sadistics, I call it. Do you notice anything unusual about this chart? Well, look at the intervals. The first interval is 121 points. Then we have 30 points, 30 points, and then 830 points. Now, if you did that on your statistics test, you'd get an F, okay? But they get away with it in the journals. It's complete cheating. I redrew the graph with 100-point intervals, and now it looks very different, doesn't it? First of all, there's no visible difference between 185 and 384, the vast majority of the population. There's no greater increase of risk in heart disease here than here, okay? But what about if you're way up here at 1,000? Well, there is a very small increase in risk, but it's not enough to make you scared. It's not like this, okay? So they've basically taken trivial results and made them look scary by having this really large interval, the last interval being really large. Oh, yes, yes, blood pressure also. This trick is, they do this a lot. The actual rate of increase between 182 and 244 was 0.13%. I mean, trivial. You can't even see it on the graph. But Dr. Stamler, who was working on this, said that between 182 and 244, there's a 240% increase in risk. So how did he take this tiny number, trivial increase, and make it seem so scary? 240% increase in risk. Well, they used something called relative risk. It's a new concept that they use to promote this theory. And here's how it works. Suppose the death rate from heart disease is at 240 is 2 per thousand, and at 160 is 1 per thousand. The rate difference, the absolute risk, is 1/1000th. But the difference in relative risk is 100% because 2 is 100% greater than 1. Now suppose the death rate at 240 is 2 per billion and at 160 is 1 per billion. The difference in rate or absolute risk is 1/100000th. But the difference in relative risk is still 100% because 2 is 100% greater than 1. What they've done is get rid of the denominator, just comparing the numerator. Now, most of you didn't take statistics, but you all took fractions, you know. And if you did that on your fractions test, you'd get an F. But basically, they're ignoring the size of the sample. Cholesterol theory proponents usually exaggerate the benefits by reporting them in terms of relative risk and minimize the side effects by reporting them in terms of absolute risk. It's interesting that a number of years later, in 1992, the director, William Castelli, published this statement in a very obscure journal. In Framingham, Massachusetts, the more saturated fat one ate, the more cholesterol one ate, the more calories one ate, the lower people's serum cholesterol. We found that the people who ate the most cholesterol, ate the most saturated fat, ate the most calories, weighed the least, and were the most physically active. So, lower cholesterol, more physically active, lower weight from people eating basically animal fats. But did this reach the front pages of the New York Times? Unfortunately not. The second study was called the Multiple Risk Factor Intervention Trial, Mr. Fit. Okay, they have really come up with really great names for these trials. Mr. Fit involved 362,000 men, and they looked at deaths rather than events, and that really is a much better marker. Death is death, events can be interpreted. And then cholesterol levels, and they used the right differences, the right intervals. And they found that, yes, as cholesterol gets higher, there is an increase in deaths from heart disease, going from under 1 to about 2. So yeah, there was an increase. However, total deaths at low cholesterol went up, more than wiped out any benefit from lower deaths from heart disease. These deaths were stroke, cancer, intestinal diseases, kidney disease, liver disease, all the really long, horrible, painful ways to die. And we find this kind of paradox in many, many studies. There's actually more deaths and more awful kinds of deaths if you have low cholesterol. The interesting thing is that the people who had high cholesterol and dying almost invariably were on blood pressure medication. And they actually stopped this trial early so that these results did not become statistically significant. Okay. Now, a very interesting statement was made by Dr. John LaRosa of the American Heart Association. He said, this curve starts to inflect after 200. Now, to me, the word inflect means starts to go up at a greater rate. I mean, here's an inflection here. Here's an inflection here. But it didn't. It's just kind of gradually going up line. But this was, they were kind of preparing people for this number, 200, as you will see. The final one that you guys paid for, or our parents paid for, Lipid Research Clinic's Coronary Primary Prevention Trial. This is the one where Fred Mattson was working in the background. Very expensive trial, $150 million. It was not a diet trial. One group was on a cholesterol-lowering drug, one was on a placebo. However, all of the subjects in both groups were subjected to propaganda in small groups from dietitians putting them on low cholesterol, low saturated fat diets. Basically, this money was spent on propagandizing for the food industry. The researchers claimed that the group taking the drug had a 17% reduction in heart disease, Mary Enig got hold of the data, and she found no difference in heart disease between the drug and placebo group. The average cholesterol reduction was 8.5%, and this has led to a statement which you may have heard. For each 1% reduction in cholesterol, we can expect a 2% reduction in coronary heart disease events. So this is truly junk science. Again, the group taking the drug had an increase in deaths from cancer, stroke, also violence and suicide. Again, this is a very common pattern that we see. Now, when this came out, the media, the popular press, had a frenzy. This was all over the newspapers. And this study, which was not a diet study, was portrayed as the long-sought proof that animal fats are the cause of heart disease. So they really put a spin on this. Interestingly enough, 30 years after the Framingham study, they went back and looked at people that they had investigated earlier. And what they found was that those who had lower cholesterol had a greater risk of death. They found for each 1% drop of cholesterol, there was an 11% increase in coronary and total mortality. Now, the other type of study they use are what are called epidemiological studies, and a very famous one by Ansel Keys, whom I'm sure you've heard of. One of the studies he did was a 6-country study, and this is how the results were published. And it just looks like a almost perfect correspondence between deaths from heart disease and percentage of calories from fat in the overall diet of the country. Almost too good for biological systems, right? When you work in biology, things don't look so good. That should raise a little red flag right there. A couple things I want to point out here. In Japan, and actually all through the Orient, it's very dishonorable to die of a heart attack. But it's very honorable to die of stroke. And so it's very, you don't know whether to believe the death certificates. Doctors want to have patients die in an honorable way, and they don't want to dishonor the families, so very often they just put stroke down when it was actually a heart disease. Also, Dr. Keys was in Italy in 1950. He said that the diet there was low in fat. I guess he didn't have pepperoni pizza or linguine alfredo. But actually, the diet at that time was not only low in fat, it was low in food. People were starving to death, and he totally misrepresented the Italian diet. But even leaving this aside, let's just see what he did. This was the data available to him at the time. He basically drew the graph that he wanted, and then he just left off the points that didn't fit the graph. You have to be very careful of epidemiology. It's so easy to treat. Now, another study that he did found some very interesting things. He found these country pairs. For example, in Finland, people have high cholesterol, but in North Karelia, they have a lot of heart disease, whereas in West Finland, they don't have much heart disease. And he found similar patterns in Middle Europe, in Italy, and in the Mediterranean, in Greece. But no one went back to look at this again. Dr. Keys was certainly not interested. This would have been so revealing to find out why there were such differences in heart disease deaths when people had the same level of cholesterol. Finally, the Monica study, which looked at deaths from heart disease versus cholesterol levels in the population, average cholesterol levels. And if we discard China and Japan, where we know the death certificates are very unreliable, we basically have no correlation. We have a couple of points for France down here. This is the French paradox. But there's basically no correlation between deaths from heart disease and cholesterol levels. However, there was a big push at the time to bring margarine into Sweden, and this is how this study was published in the Swedish newspapers. So basically, they just picked 3 of the points. So they were very choosy. And that's one of the big problems with epidemiology. It's so easy to cheat. And I showed you this earlier, the countries in Europe with the highest saturated fat consumption have the lowest rates of heart disease, all these paradoxes. And I bring you to the wisdom of Galileo. By denying scientific principles, one may maintain any paradox. Okay, moving on to 1984, as soon as they finished the lipid research clinics trials, they convened the Cholesterol Consensus Conference, which was designed to appear objective and comprehensive. What the public didn't realize is at this time there was an absolute outcry in the scientific community. So many scientists objected to what was going on. So they were invited, they were allowed to speak, their names were on the program, but their views were not included in the final report. And this is another trick they do. They bring the dissenters, they put their names on the program, but then they come up with this consensus that has nothing to do with what these dissenters said, but because their names are on the program, it looks like they finally acquiesced and came around, came to their senses, and agreed with the consensus. The funny thing about this is that the report was actually written before the conference was convened. Mary was there with her colleague, and the colleague picked up somebody's papers by mistake, and in that stack of papers was the final report. On the first day of the conference, all been written except for a few numbers to be filled in, and the main number was, what is going to be the risk point? Is it a cholesterol of 200? Is it 240? What is it going to be? And Mary, who seemed to be in the right place at the right time, overheard an argument between the three conference organizers, and two of them were saying, look, the average cholesterol in this country is 240. We can't make the risk point less than 240. But Rifkin, who was in charge of all of this, he said, no, we have to make it 200, otherwise we won't have enough people to test, and by inference to treat. So that was how that number was chosen. Everybody with a cholesterol over 200 was at risk for heart disease, okay? And they were going to be recommended the prudent diet, low in saturated fat and cholesterol, even though we have had no long-term studies on such a diet. Now today, that risk point has gone down. Now I think it's about 180. And if you have a heart attack, you are put on statins no matter what your cholesterol is. Even if it's dangerously low, which it often is, you are still put on a cholesterol-lowering drug. In fact, virtually all seniors are put on these drugs. It's very hard to keep them from giving the drugs to your seniors if they're in a nursing home. And that launched the National Cholesterol Education Program. It was officially launched at this conference, but the planning had begun a year before, and the stated goal was to change physicians' attitudes. The public had bought in, but the physicians were still skeptical. All physicians received a physician's kit. This was sent to all doctors in the United States. The pharmaceutical industry was on this coordinating committee, so now we're starting to see this emphasis on drugs to reduce cholesterol. And of course, the dietary recommendations. Now it's become official U.S. government policy to use margarine instead of butter. What a triumph of influence and advertising to get the government to push this for you, to push your product for you. This was 1984. Pardon me? Well, first and foremost, it was motivated by the food industry. But then the pharmaceuticals, they saw an opportunity here. So they got on board as well. Now, in 1990, the National Institutes of Health amended these recommendations. Now, remember, when this started, this is going to be for middle-aged men. They amended these recommendations to include all Americans above the age of 2. All Americans above the age of 2. That is official government policy. All Americans above the age of 2 should be on the prudent diet using margarine instead of butter. And it hasn't changed. So now, when mothers took their babies, 2-year-old babies, for the 2-year-old checkup, they got the lecture. No more whole milk. No butter. Reduce eggs. Reduce fat. How many of you have gotten that lecture? A few. There's always a few. Okay? This is more than just bad advice. This is genocide. This is starvation of our children. This is putting our children on a third world diet that will prevent reproduction, normal growth, prevent development of their brains. And this is official government policy. And during all these years with all this junk science and, propaganda going on, there was a lot of good science going on. I'm not against science. I'm just against the, using science as a kind of a prostitute for industry. There was a lot of good science going on. We learned how important cholesterol is for growth and development. We learned about the fat-soluble vitamins. We learned about growth hormones. We've learned about sex hormones. All this was going on. So this flew in the face of all the science that was out there. And there were many studies. I don't have time to go into them in detail, but there were many studies that contradicted this. One of the most interesting was the International Atherosclerosis Project, which looked at 31,000 autopsies in 15 countries. They found no correlation between animal fat intake and the degree of atherosclerosis or the cholesterol level. They found vegetarians with high levels of cholesterol and blockage, and they found meat eaters with no blockage and everything in between. There was just no correlation. And independent researchers were still speaking out. George Mann, who'd been with the Framingham Project, he said, "The public is being deceived by the greatest health scam of the century." And Michael Gurr, author of the definitive textbook on lipid biochemistry, says, "Whatever causes heart disease, it is not primarily a high intake of saturated fatty acids." He wrote a big paper summarizing all the research to date. And I actually got in touch with him and asked if he would come and speak at our conference. And he said, no. He said, "I was so disgusted with what was being called science." He said, I've turned my back on the whole thing. And he said, I haven't kept up with the research, so he wouldn't come, which it would have been great to have him. Finally, let's look at what is this stuff called cholesterol? It's often called a fat, but it's not a fat. It's a sterile molecule, more like a wax. It's made by every cell in your body. Do you think something that's made by every cell in your body might be necessary? Okay. One of its main jobs is it's incorporated in your cell membrane. It makes your cell membranes waterproof, so you can have a different chemistry on the inside and the outside of the cell. It's nature's healing substance. It repairs wounds. There's a lot of cholesterol in scar tissue. And if you have tears in your arteries, if you have fragile arteries, that cholesterol, you want to have high cholesterol. Believe me, that's your repair substance going in to repair those wounds. It gives structure to the cells. It's the precursor to vitamin D. If you have low cholesterol and you're out in the sun, you won't make a lot of vitamin D. It's the precursor to the bile salts, which we need for fat digestion. As we saw, it's vital to create sex hormones and protective steroid hormones. We hear a lot about antioxidants. Cholesterol is a powerful antioxidant. It protects our cell membranes from free radicals. And it's essential for the development and function of the brain and nervous system, and needed for the proper functioning of the serotonin receptors in the brain. Now, one of the consistent results of studies showing people with low cholesterol is violent antisocial behavior, suicide, depression. And here's the explanation. You need cholesterol for the feel-good chemicals in your body to work. And we looked at this earlier. Cholesterol is the mother of all hormones. So, a summary of cholesterol research. Cholesterol levels increase naturally and gradually with age. You want your cholesterol to be higher as you age because you need more protection as you age. And especially in this culture where we almost can't avoid the vegetable oils, the free radicals, the cholesterol is protecting you against that. It's very difficult to get an accurate reading. Cholesterol levels vary with stress, the time of day, fasting or non-fasting, and the type of test used. Typically in the shopping malls, they use a test that gives you a higher level, kind of pull you into that system. They did a study with college students. They were measuring their cholesterol levels every week, and one week everybody's cholesterol went up. And they couldn't figure this out until they realized it was midterm exams. Kids were under a lot of stress, So they made cholesterol so they could make stress hormones. Now, what would have happened if they'd given them cholesterol-lowering drugs? They might not have been able to deal with the stress of their exams. They might have stressed out or something. In men, it is true there's a slightly greater risk of heart disease for cholesterol levels above 300. There is a slightly greater risk. It doesn't mean that the cholesterol is causing that risk, but there is an association there. But there's no appreciable difference for heart disease for cholesterol levels between 180 and 300, which is the vast majority. For women and the elderly, so all women of all ages and men over 60, there's no appreciable difference in heart disease rate for any level of cholesterol. In fact, for women of all ages and for the elderly, higher cholesterol is associated with a longer lifespan. That's a really critical fact. First of all, women, any doctor telling you need to lower your cholesterol, he does not know what he's talking about. There is no correlation in women. Over 60, a doctor's telling you to lower your cholesterol, he does not know what he is talking about, because higher cholesterol is associated with a longer lifespan. And as I said, autopsy studies show zero correlation between animal fat intake and the degree of atherosclerosis or serum cholesterol level. What about LDL and HDL? Isn't LDL the bad cholesterol and HDL the good cholesterol? Actually, no study has shown that elevated LDL is a problem. We know that HDL protects, and so they just came up with this thing, well, the LDL must be the bad one. We know that there's greater deaths at low cholesterol. Many studies have shown this. Deaths from cancer are higher for individuals with cholesterol lower than 180. Now, the cholesterol in our food is fine. It's fine to eat. The one thing we want to avoid is oxidized cholesterol. So how does cholesterol get oxidized? There's two ways. One is if an animal food is sprayed through a tiny hole. So powdered eggs, powdered milk, that has oxidized cholesterol in it. And they add powdered milk to low-fat milk to give it body. So it's in our low-fat milks. The other way cholesterol can be oxidized is if you're eating a lot of polyunsaturated oils. That will oxidize the cholesterol in your bloodstream. And it has been shown that this oxidized cholesterol plays a very important role in the initiation of plaque buildup in the arteries. And finally, cholesterol-lowering drugs do not lower the risk of heart disease, but they do increase the risk of cancer, intestinal diseases, depression, suicide, and violent behavior. In fact, there was a study coming out that just came out looking at long-term use of statin drugs compared to controls. And what they found was if you use these statin drugs for many, many years, and this was kind of a hand-picked population, your increase in lifespan would be, I think it was about 3 days. Okay? But of course you had all the side effects as well. There are over 200 risk factors for heart disease. There's something called lipoprotein little a if that's elevated, homocysteine, type A behavior. Loss and bereavement is a big risk factor. If you've lost somebody through death, it's often heart attacks, come like broken heart syndrome afterwards. Short stature, low birth weight, elevated uric acid is a very strong predictor of heart disease. C-reactive protein, low vitamin D, underactive thyroid, lack of exercise, obesity, smoking, we all know those are risk factors. Snoring, baldness, having a hairy chest, having earlobe creases, having hairy earlobes, being poor in a rich country and being rich in a poor country, and elevated cholesterol in some population groups. The point is that a risk factor is not a cause, and lowering your cholesterol to protect yourself against heart disease is sort of like cutting your earlobes off if they're hairy. Okay? It's not going to lower your risk. It's just an association. Electron beam tomography is a way of measuring calcium buildup in the arteries, and it's calcium that makes the arteries hard. And this correlates strongly with total plaque, strongly with the degree of obstruction. It's a strong predictor of coronary heart disease events. And this looked at LDL cholesterol versus calcium, and actually it showed that LDL cholesterol was just slightly protective. So here's what we call the oiling of America. Since the turn of the century, butter consumption has plummeted, lard consumption has plummeted, shortening has tripled, and the shortening in 1909 was actually made of lard and coconut oil, not vegetable oils. Look at margarine, but look at the vegetable oils. It's a 16-fold increase. And where are we using those vegetable oils? Yeah, well, we put them on lettuce. And that's why lettuce causes heart disease, see? It's a perfect theory. Yeah, so this is bad news. These things are horrible. They're made with the cheapest oils, and then the list of other ingredients is horrendous. Make your own salad dressing. We always say, it's the first thing you can do to improve your diet. Make your own salad dressing. This was an ad that appeared in 1970 in the Journal of the American Heart Association, and it's a heart wrapped up in a Fleischmann's margarine wrapper, and it says, "Eat to your heart's content." That's the kind of stuff that was going on. Now, they would not get away with this today. It's a lot more subtle today. And this, you could write in and get a complete cholesterol depressant menus and recipe books. And this was in the Journal of the American Medical Association also. And this one is advertising corn oil for people with high blood pressure. And there is not a shred of evidence that using corn oil or vegetable oils will lower your blood pressure, but that's what they were promoting it for. Just remember that as coronary heart disease and cancer have soared in this country, butter consumption has plummeted. We don't know all the reasons for this, but one thing for sure is not butter consumption, because it's been going in the opposite direction. Let's see. Okay, so this was a study on fats in 1965. There were 3 groups. One group these were people who'd already had a heart attack, high-risk patients. One group was given corn oil, one was given olive oil, and one was given saturated animal fats. The corn oil group had lower cholesterol, but only 52% were alive after 2 years. And the olive oil group was not much better. Only 57% were alive after 2 years. The animal fat group did best of all. 75% were alive after 2 years. Just quickly, 2000, I know, I know. It boggles the mind. It boggles the mind. These studies over the past 20 years, they found total fat intake bore no significant relationship to coronary artery disease risk. And 4 epidemiological studies have shown no evidence that men who eat less fat live longer or have fewer heart attacks. So there's many ways that they cheat. We've talked about some of them: exaggerating trivial results, using the concept of relative risk, graphs with unequal intervals, just moving down, using confounding a risk factor with a cause. The abstracts do not accurately represent the findings. Lots and lots of ways they cheat. And this was a photograph I took in the Raleigh-Durham airport a number of years ago. This is considered the research triangle. So you've got a young doctor. He's just received $1 million grant to do a study, but he's got this little niggling fear, well, suppose I don't get the results that they want me to get. And he walks through the airport and he sees this ad for quintiles, which is one of these study groups, and it says, "Don't worry, lucky you, you don't have to worry about results when Quintiles handles your clinical trial." So the general public wouldn't have a clue what this meant, but the doctor with the $1 million grant, he knows what they're saying. We'll get the results that you want. Finally, the cholesterol-lowering drugs called statins act to reduce the production of cholesterol in the liver. Many different names: Lipitor, Zocor, etc. They were discovered by the Japanese, who found them to be so toxic that they thought there's no possible use for these, and they sold them to Merck. They sold their patent to Merck, who got FDA approval with unexplained speed. In every rodent study, the statins have caused cancer, and they're currently being promoted for healthy men and women categorized as at risk because they have cholesterol levels over 200 or even less. And you have to have a lot of sympathy for these doctors. They're absolutely trapped in this system. Their bonuses are depend on how many prescriptions they write, and not only their bonus, but the bonus of the whole office that they work for. So if they work for an HMO, if they say, I don't want to prescribe statins, then everybody else in the office has a lower bonus. So you can see the kind of peer pressure that's on these people. And the only one who's going to protect you from this is you. Okay, you just say no. And of course, he'll kick you out of his practice, but that's okay too. Tremendous side effects: fatigue and weakness, memory loss, reduced mental capacity, neuropathy, slowed reactions, muscle wasting leading to back pain and heart failure. Remember, the heart is a muscle. Intestinal diseases, now they find that it causes pancreatic problems and even diabetes. When this was discovered, they said, well, the still benefits outweigh the risks. You still should take statins, even if it gives you diabetes. Reduced libido, depression, accidents, suicide, cancer. And if you don't believe me, go to askapatient.com, search for Lipitor, and see what people are saying about the side effects they had. Horrendous side effects. But by and large, most of them are happy because, oh, my cholesterol came down. So statins are a very good cure for cholesterol anxiety. If you suffer from cholesterol anxiety, you want to be sure to take a statin. But if you want to be healthy, I would not take a statin. Rates of heart failure have doubled since the statins came into use because the muscle can't work. They interfere with your body's production of coenzyme Q10, which is your muscles need to work. And they also block the absorption of vitamin A, which of course we know is so important. The Honolulu Heart Program. Research is an excellent program. They looked over 20 years at all-cause mortality, and here was their conclusions. Our data accords with previous findings of increased mortality in elderly people with low serum cholesterol, and show that long-term persistence of low cholesterol concentration actually increases the risk of death. Thus, the earlier that patients start to lower cholesterol concentrations, the greater the risk of death. And this has been shown in similar studies published in other journals. Seniors with low cholesterol have a greater risk of dying. And a meta-analysis, again, 2003, found no difference really in patients being treated and those not being treated, but lots and lots of side effects in the treatment group. Here's a Lipitor ad implying that slim young women, just as much as hefty men, should be on Lipitor. And there's a little bit of fine print here, which I'm going to read to you. Lipitor is a prescription drug used with diet to lower cholesterol. Lipitor is not for everyone, including those with liver disease or possible liver problems. Well, how do you know if you have a possible liver problem? Okay. Women who are nursing, pregnant, or may become pregnant. And we've seen doctors prescribe Lipitor and statins to women of childbearing age. And of course, now there's a big push to sell it over the counter. So a lot of young women are going to be taking this. Statins cause horrible, what they call class X birth defects, horrible birth defects. And finally, here's the coup de grace here. Lipitor has not been shown to prevent heart disease or heart attacks. So why are you going to take this? Well, if it ain't cholesterol, what causes heart disease? There's many other theories, starting with Dr. Price. He believed that heart disease was caused by a deficiency of vitamins A and D. Refined carbs, trans fats, omega-6 fatty acids, oxidized cholesterol, various deficiencies. The latest one is K2 deficiency, heated milk protein, in other words, pasteurization, homogenization, thyroid deficiency, coffee consumption, lack of exercise, inflammation, stress. I mean, there's many, many theories of what causes heart disease, and there's probably truth in all of them, but there's no money to study this because all of the grants go through the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and they are totally committed to the diet heart theory. Who profits? It's a huge industry. It's the biggest boondoggle the drug companies ever had. And then we have all the fabricated food. That's America's biggest industry. Cancer then, the diseases caused by these foods is a big industry. And then our new industry, growth failure and learning disabilities in children. I mean, this is very profitable to a lot of people. So, here's our recipe for a healthcare crisis and enormous profits. The ingredients are greed, envy, ignorance, manipulation, cunning, extortion, lies, and fraud. And here are the instructions. 1. Conspire to convince the populace that the natural whole foods that have nourished mankind for millennia, such as eggs, butter, whole raw milk, and red meat, are dangerous and unhealthy. 2. Train the medical profession to advocate antibiotics, vaccinations, fluoride, and fabricated foods as scientifically proven methods for preventing illness. 3. Ignore or suppress healing methods that work, claim that real diseases have no cure or do not exist. If you suffer from chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia, you keep going back to the doctor and they don't have anything to give you. You have all these symptoms. And finally, they tell you, I'm going to give you a prescription for an antidepressant. Lady, it's all in your head. Has anyone had that happen to them? Usually a few hands go up. Finally, define normal human conditions such as menopause. Remember, we made a disease out of menopause. We've also made a disease out of pregnancy. Okay? And average cholesterol levels as illnesses which must be treated with expensive drugs that create serious side effects. Then you stew, broil, half bake, or boil as the occasion requires. And this serves 300 million people. And that is the oiling of America. Thank you. Thank you. Lots of articles on our website if you still don't believe me, or if you want to convince somebody else. One of our most frequently visited articles is called Dangers of Statin Drugs. It's right on our website. And then cholesterolandhealth.com is a good one, and Ravenscoff's website on cholesterol is also very good. And then, of course, all of our articles and everything. Normally, I open up for questions. We are going to take a break. I want to make sure that we can all visit all of the exhibitors before they have to go. So we're going to take a 20-minute break, and please use this time wisely to see the exhibitors. And then we'll come back for my own health secrets, which is kind of short. It's just about half an hour. All right, we have the diehards here who stayed to the bitter end. Thank you very much for rounding people up. So I'm just going to be really practical in this talk. These are some strategies that I have found that work for me. So we'll just start with the first one. First and foremost, 3 regular meals per day. I think Americans are very chaotic. They tend to be very chaotic in their eating patterns, eating between meals and skipping meals. And our bodies do like a regular rhythm. They like to know when food is coming. They like to know when you're not going to eat food, and it will adjust to produce digestive juices. If you're regular and 3 meals a day and pretty much at the same time, it's really a lot easier on your body. And those meals should contain some animal protein. It could be cheese or meat or fish or eggs. They should contain some animal fat. And they should also contain some carbs. We're not a kind of diet that says don't eat carbs or whatever. All traditional cultures, virtually all, had carbs. So I think it's very important to get a kind of discipline in your meals. And above all, you want to avoid the blood sugar roller coaster with your blood sugar going up and down, up and down. That's extremely stressful for your adrenal glands. And really, your adrenal glands, what the Chinese call the kidney fire, is the basis of health and vitality. So that means plenty of fat with every meal. That will, kind of level off the blood sugar. Now, if you like sweet things, always eat those sweet things with good fats and at the end of a meal. The very worst thing you can do is eat something sweet between a meal on an empty stomach. It's devastating to your adrenal glands, to your blood sugar, to your mood. You want to be depressed? Just eat sweet things between a meal. An hour later, you're going to be depressed, you know. And the corollary is no food between meals. Get your body on a rhythm of regular meals. I can't stress how important this is. So, healthy breakfast, eggs and meat. But it could be other things. Smoked fish, cheese and sourdough bread. That's, grab and go breakfast. Doesn't mean you have to cook breakfast, but you need breakfast. Soaked oatmeal with butter. Soaked pancakes, the pancake recipe in Nourishing Traditions is really delicious with bacon or sausage, maybe some leftovers, maybe some soup. But you really want to make sure you have that good breakfast. They say breakfast is the most important meal of a day. Eat breakfast like a king. This is what I call a cruel breakfast. We showed this before. And these are good breakfasts. Lots of fat. That fat carries you all through the day. And we talked about the oatmeal. Talking to somebody who said he learned to soak his oatmeal and it just kind of changed his life. Where are you? Are you here? No, we were having a conversation earlier. I used to think I was allergic to oatmeal. If I didn't soak my oatmeal by about 10 o'clock in the morning, I'd have something like a toxic shock. I'd get clammy and sweaty and faint, and I'd have terrible digestive pains. Has anyone had that? Yeah. Usually a few hands go up. Once I learned to soak my oatmeal, no problem. Oh, yeah? Oh. There you go. Soak it in kombucha. Mm-hmm. I'll have to try that. And, of course, plenty of butter. Now, that may be too much butter. Healthy lunches. Now, for us on the farm, lunch is kind of catch as catch can. I don't prepare a formal lunch. I eat when I come in. My husband eats when he comes in. We kind of get it for ourselves. And this is where you eat the nutrient-dense convenience foods. This is my time to eat sacred foods. I usually make huge batches of pâté and freeze them in little canisters, little ramekins. And I'll take one out in the morning and I'll have pâté, cheese. I like to eat fish eggs, and every now and then I'll splurge on the least expensive kind of fish eggs that I can buy. And then homemade soups is another good lunch. So for me, lunch is my sacred food time. You can get wild caviar. I sort of think that there's so much goodness in caviar that kind of doesn't matter. Here's how I eat my caviar. I make the little pancakes from my recipe, and I dry them out in the oven so they're crispy. They're like a little cracker. And then I put sour cream and a little bit of caviar and some chopped onions and some parsley. And these are so delicious. And 3 of them and you're full. 3 of them and you're full. So it's not like you're eating tons and tons of caviar, but it sure does satisfy you. Quiche is a fun thing to make. There's a great recipe in my book called yogurt dough, which is easy to make. It's soaked overnight and easy to roll out. And what is quiche? It's basically cholesterol pie, right? It's eggs and cheese and cream. And you can make quiche and make a couple of big ones and freeze them or refrigerate them and heat them up. Now, rich foods like this, you eat them with a sour condiment. So sauerkraut, and there's some kombucha. That is a delicious, satisfying lunch. Healthy dinners. That's when I really like to get in the kitchen and cook. Meat or fish. I love to make sauces or with fat. If I don't make a sauce, we just put lots of butter. Vegetables with the fat. What are vegetables for? What's the purpose of vegetables? Butter. I mean, yeah, vehicle for fat, yeah. Or cream, yeah. And carbs as tolerated. Now, how much carbs you eat, it depends. Now, when my kids were home, my boys were doing football, they were very active. You really have to give them some carbs, or they're not going to fill up, they're not going to have enough energy. So we would have rice or brown rice or potatoes or corn or something like that. And typically I'd eat a spoonful, and the boys would eat a big pile of it. So if I ate any more, I'd start gaining weight. But you need some carbs in your diet. They satisfy you, they taste good. But how much carb you eat really depends on your energy level and possibly your age also. And the food must be satisfying. It's a real simple way to make your food satisfying. Just put butter on it. Butter and salt. Anything tastes good with butter and salt. And we showed the puritanical diet, and it comes in all sorts of forms, kind of disguised. But when they're talking about lean meat, skinless chicken breasts, dry vegetables, bread, whole wheat bread without any butter on it, just a little bit of oil, that's the puritanical diet. And they know that it creates cravings and that you're going to go for the pornographic foods. So I can't stress enough, these are health foods. These are healthy foods for you, which is good news, right? The really delicious foods are the healthy foods. Don't be afraid of the skin on the chicken. A lot of collagen in there, arachidonic acid, which is this omega-6 fatty acid that we need just as much as DHA or EPA. Vitamin K, lots of vitamin K there. The skin kind of balances the amino acids in the skin, balance the amino acids in the meat. And it just doesn't make sense that we shouldn't eat it. Like sweet things? Make your own. They do put appetite stimulants in commercial cookies. I don't know if you read Stitt's book, Fighting the Food Giants. They actually did these studies, and they would watch their employees behind smoky glass, and they'd have different stimulants in different cookies, and they would find that some appetite stimulants worked for some people and some worked for others. For example, this guy, if you put this appetite stimulant in, he'd eat the whole box of cookies, but that didn't have any effect on this person over here, so they put them all in. Appetite stimulator. So it's an addiction technology that the food companies have, and they put these substances in things like cookies and chips, so you can't eat just one. Okay, so you have to eat more and more. That's why I say make your own cookies. The cookies in Nourishing Traditions are really delicious. They're based on crispy nuts. These are soaked nuts. We use arrowroot powder and not flour, so they're gluten-free. They have a lot of butter in them, natural sweetener like rapadura, and the flavorings. And this is just one example. There's almond cookies, cashew cookies, pecan cookies. Anyone made the cookies in Nourishing Traditions? Just one of you. And the interesting thing about these cookies is that you can't eat two. You really can only eat one. They are so satisfying. And that's the way a dessert should be. Should be satisfy your sweet tooth with just one and not make you eat and eat and eat. Cheese is a really great food. You can travel with it. Always travel with cheese. It doesn't have to be refrigerated for a while. You can keep it out of the refrigerator, and it is a complete food. More advice: eat mostly home-cooked food. I mean, you're going to eat at restaurants sometimes. You're going to go out with friends sometimes, but mostly home-cooked food. Sit down to eat. Very important. When you sit down to eat, your body's getting a signal it's time to eat. The saliva gets going, the digestive juices get going, and everything will be easier to digest. And then finally, eat with others. That's the time when you sit down, you're relaxed, you're quiet, you have good conversation. Or if there's nobody there, eat with a good book. Not eat the good book, but with a good book to read. Now, it's very important to have family meals, but I've had people tell me that family meals were so unpleasant that they can't eat family meals. They were so awful because family meals were used as a time to put the children down, to have horrible family arguments. We had this rule: no unpleasant conversation at meals. Everybody got a chance to speak. And you don't use family meals as a time to chastise one of the children and embarrass them in front of the others. That's done privately, because chastising them is not about humiliating them, okay? So you only want pleasant conversation at your meals. Eat while sitting down, not while walking. Now, Europeans think Americans are very vulgar because we eat while we're walking. And we need some kind of campaign to teach some eating manners, because it's not only kind of vulgar, but also it's not good for you. It's not good to eat and walk. Your body's trying to do two things at once. Eating is not a time for exercising, and exercising is not a time for eating. Okay, so that's number one. The regular meals, sit down to eat, mostly home-cooked food. And those are good general guidelines for you. 2 is to pay attention to digestion. And I think most dietary schemes out there just ignore digestion. One of the things that we say about our diet is it pays a lot of attention to digestion. Because after all, it's not only what you eat, it's what you digest and assimilate. So first and foremost, digestion of fats. Now, does anyone have trouble with fats here? I had someone come up to me this morning. I like Swedish bitters. You take a teaspoon and mix it with a little water, have it just before a meal, or sometimes you can have it in the morning and the evening. And this will help you with the production of bile, and it's just very supportive of liver function. You know, we don't get enough bitter foods in our diet, and these are herbs that are known to support digestion. Lacto-fermented foods, really you should have a little bit of sauerkraut or some kind of lacto-fermented food with every meal. Lemon juice or vinegar in water is good, and let's just say you're at a restaurant and you can't get kombucha there or some kind of lacto-fermented beverage. Just ask for water and a slice of lemon. Put a little bit of salt in there, and you'll have a nice soft drink right there. If none of this works, you might try taking an ox bile tablet with your meals. And these are readily available on the internet. Lacto-fermented beet kvass is a wonderful drink. I've had more positive feedback about beet kvass than any other thing in Nourishing Traditions as a way to treat digestive disorders and fatigue. And it's basically just beets, a little bit of whey, making the whey from yogurt, salt, and water, and you leave it on the counter for a few days, and then you have beet kvass. And this is my tonic. And I have about 2 ounces every morning. And I've done it for years and years, and it definitely settled my stomach. And I think it was a big factor in giving me more energy. One of the things that's in beet kvass is betaine. And betaine helps use B12 and conserve B12 in your body. So there's a side effect of helping your B12 levels. Digestion of protein. Now, how many people have trouble with eating meat? Yeah, I hear that all the time. First and foremost, plenty of salt. Plenty of salt in your diet, salt on your meat, even salted meats. You need that salt to produce hydrochloric acid. Secondly, eat the meat with the fat. The fat's there for a reason. It helps you digest the meat. Eat the meat with broth. Now, I got a letter from someone who had been unable to eat meat all his life. And when he learned to make broth, and then he would cut his meat up in the broth, suddenly he could eat meat. A really nice soup is to saute ground beef or ground red meat or whatever with some onions, Add broth, seasonings, put some chopped green vegetables in there. That makes a lovely soup and a nice way to eat meat. The last one might be surprising because we're always told never eat fruit with protein, but eat meat with tropical fruit, like the Indians who ate their meat with bananas or papaya or mango or pineapple. You can make a beautiful chutney or lacto-fermented pineapple chutney and be great with meat if you're having trouble digesting meat. I know that's eyebrow raising there, but. Now, digestion of carbohydrates. First and foremost, proper preparation of grains, and they eat the carbs with adequate fat. Now, if you're still having serious digestive problems, we recommend the GAPS diet. GAPS stands for Gut and Psychology Syndrome. How many of you are familiar with that diet? Okay. How many people have tried that diet? Okay. Did it work? No. Did it work for any of you? Yeah. Yeah. So basically what it is you get off all the offending foods. Carbs, even potatoes, grains, dairy, and you just eat a lot of broth, good fats, and meat, liver, and you take cod liver oil, and this helps heal the gut. And then once it's healed, you can add some of these foods back in that you had to take out. Usually you can go back to raw milk and properly prepared grains. Okay, what happens when you eat at a restaurant? What do you do? Well, choose higher end restaurants, not fast food restaurants. Okay, try to avoid fast food restaurants. Order simple foods and put butter on everything. Okay. Avoid the soups in restaurants unless you know that they have truly prepared those soups from scratch. We were traveling, and we'd been traveling for about 3 weeks. We were coming home through London. We were staying in a hotel, and I really had felt the effects. I just felt like my stomach felt kind of dead. And they had a fish soup on the menu, and I said to the waitress, would you go back and ask the chef, did he make this soup from a powder or did he make it from bones? And she came back and she said, he made it from bones. And so I ordered the soup and I felt so much better after this soup. But usually the answer will be powder. Oh yes, this soup is homemade from a powder. And it's this powder that comes in a can, they call it a soup base, and it's basically MSG. And that's what you don't want. So be very careful about soups in restaurants. And also the salad dressings, because they are like these bottled dressings. If you can ask them, if they have real olive oil, just say I would like bring me the olive oil and vinegar, or olive oil and lemon juice. Some people carry a little bottle of olive oil with them in their purse. And of course you want to avoid fried foods in restaurants. So those are 3 things that you really want to avoid in restaurants unless you know for sure how they're made. Soups, salad dressings, and fried foods. There's a question back here. Yeah. Yes, I didn't mean it to come out negative. It's a diet that works for most people. Yeah. And this is for people with really serious digestive problems. Gut dysbiosis, people who've been on lots of antibiotics, kids who started out, really bad diet, vaccination damaged kids, and so forth. When we're at restaurants, I usually order fried eggs and bacon for breakfast. I ask they cook the eggs in butter if you can. Why fried eggs? Well, you don't want to order scrambled eggs because in most restaurants those are coming out of a carton. Lots of additives. At least if you see a fried egg, you know that egg has come out of a shell. Okay. And come out of a shell that morning. And I prefer to order bacon over sausage because at least when you get bacon, there's no MSG in the bacon, whereas sausage almost always has MSG in it. And of course, typical hotel breakfast, big boost in blood sugar, and then an hour later, you've got the drop. And then you're hungry again. And you got that blood sugar roller coaster. And then when your blood sugar drops, you have to eat something. So you end up kind of eating all day long. Of course, I hate to mention this, but coffee is like sugar. It boosts your blood sugar. Yes.
Finding out that with potatoes, especially and squash, a lot are coming in pre-filled, and they have to be sanitized before they're delivered.
Could be, yeah.
So that's a good thing to ask if they feel they're.
Yep, that's a very good point. What to drink while traveling? Here's an easy soft drink. Ask for sparkling water, a squeeze of lemon, and a pinch of salt. This is very refreshing. You've got your electrolytes in there with the salt. It's a little bit acidic, which helps digestion. So, avoid the worsts. I mean, we can't be 100% perfect, but what are the worsts? Industrial fats and oils, refined sweeteners, extruded and rough grains, and then MSG. And of course, most processed foods contain MSG. Yes, yes. And these are the types of food at very high levels of MSG. Where we live, people love crab and shrimp. And it's, very important foods. And of course, they're just drenched in this Old Bay seasoning. And it's loaded with MSG. And avoid, this is how they disguise it. All right, stimulants. This is a very sore subject. And we have had people drop their membership because of this. We've had a big problem with people wanting to bring chocolate desserts to our chapter potlucks. And I was a coffee drinker. I was very fortunate to have an experience. I went to see a holistic doctor because I had all of these allergies and fatigue. I was kind of a mess when I was 25 years old. And he sat me down and he looked me in the eye and he said, "You will never be well unless you stop drinking coffee." Well, it was like a wake-up call, and so I stopped, and I had probably the worst month of my life. I had a headache every day. But once that month was over with, I was amazed at how much energy I had. A lot more energy than before. When I drank coffee, I had a kind of a boost in the morning, but about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I would start winding down. I could hardly get through making dinner, and don't even talk about doing anything after dinner. It was hard to get the dishes done, and I'd fall into bed. I couldn't do anything else. Once I got off of coffee, I had plenty of energy in the morning, and it just amazed me. I had energy to make dinner. I had energy to jump up and do the dishes. I had energy to do things after dinner, to write, to pay bills, whatever. I was just amazed. It was just steady energy all day long. And that's what you want. And then you get sleepy and you go to bed and you fall asleep immediately. I know people have struggled with this. It's very, very hard to get off. It's a harder habit to break than smoking or sugar or alcohol. And tea is the same. Now, chocolate, we've been heavily criticized. Why don't you allow chocolate? Chocolate makes you feel so good. Chocolate not only contains caffeine and theobromine, both of the things in coffee and tea, but it also contains a chemical that raises dopamine. But of course, if you do it like that, then you're going to have the dopamine deficiency. And they've also discovered another chemical in chocolate that's actually quite a toxin. Chocolate also has a lot of lead, arsenic, and cadmium in it. Chocolate also has some very bad mycotoxins that come from the process for making it. I'm not saying don't eat chocolate, you do what you want, but there's no way that we can recommend a food like this. Plus, it's almost always loaded with sugar. And, there's ways of kind of hiding this. Oh, it's naturally sweetened. It's not chocolate, it's cacao, but that's chocolate. Oh, it's fermented. It's fair trade. It's good. It's fine. It's fine. No, all chocolate has these things. Just like soy. People say, oh, well, of course, I don't eat genetically modified soy. But it's not just the genetically modified soy. It's all soy. Tea, caffeinated tea is got theobromine in it, which is similar to caffeine. Now, herbal teas, certain herbal teas are fine. You got to be careful though, because herbs are like drugs. So be careful what you're drinking. Some herbal teas can disrupt your menstrual period, for example. So you need to be careful. And then, of course, soft drinks. There's nothing I need to say here about soft drinks. They're just a witch's brew. Commercial soft drinks. Well, green tea is got a stimulant in it. Yeah. That's a great question. Well, I'm going to explain right here. Okay. So this is a diagram of your adrenal gland. And you have two parts to your adrenal gland. The adrenal medulla produces adrenaline. That's your fight or flight hormone. And when you need adrenaline, then that comes into play, and you can run fast and get away from the tiger, or you can deal with a terrible boss or whatever. Then you have the adrenal cortex, which produces the chill-out corticoid hormones that relax and heal the body. And every time you have an adrenaline rush, the adrenal cortex has to start to work to get you back to homeostasis. So what happens when you eat caffeine, and also sugar, but especially caffeine, it's like a hammer on your adrenal medulla to produce fight or flight hormones, produces adrenaline. And then your adrenal cortex has to come in and try to bring things back, relax, and so forth, bring you to homeostasis. With continual stimulation from sugar and caffeine, the adrenal cortex becomes exhausted. Called adrenal exhaustion, and we can no longer deal with stress. We're tired all the time. We can't get out of bed. It's very interesting to look at traditional cultures here. And I'm not being sexist here, but the men in the cultures do the hunting and the war, and they have to get themselves hyped up for the hunt. Special ways of getting that adrenaline going. And then they have this very high adrenaline activity of the hunt. But they don't hunt every day. Once that's over, they come back to camp. They stand around and talk and gossip. They stand on one foot and sharpen their spears. And of course, the colonialists accused the primitive people of being lazy because they didn't work every day. But that wasn't good for them to work every day. They didn't have an adrenaline rush all the time. And our bodies are not designed to deal with an adrenaline rush every day, especially if you're not getting enough vitamin A, because it's vitamin A that you need to make all these hormones.
So it's not just, so say not ingesting sugar or caffeine, you could still have adrenal exhaustion.
Yes, you could. Yes, because you can't make the hormones. Yeah. Yeah. And you may never have drunk caffeine, but maybe your parents did. And that adrenal exhaustion is passed on. It's very insidious. In fact, the mother, if she's adrenally exhausted, will steal adrenal hormones from the fetus. Yeah, so that exhaustion is passed on. Yeah. I was reading an article about a child who could never go to sleep, and they was being treated with homeopathy, but of course when they did the interview, turns out the mother drank a lot of caffeine and drank caffeine through her pregnancy. Now, the child had never had caffeine, but he was suffering from the effects of the caffeine because he couldn't go to sleep at night. So these things are passed on. So anyway, as I was saying, in the primitive societies, the men, they had the adrenaline rush, but then they had the rest. The women's work did not require an adrenaline rush. They sat around and made baskets, and they gathered food. That was, low energy gathering. They were preparing food, so there was no adrenaline rush there. So they could do this work every day. Now, usually in a couple, there's one person who's out in a very high-stress job. And often today it's the woman, you know. And when that person comes home, you don't want to load a lot of stress on that person. You know, don't criticize them if they just want to sit down and do nothing. I remember my dad, when he would come home, he had a very high stress job. We couldn't talk to him for half an hour. He read the mail. He also had a martini and 2 cigarettes. But he had to decompress before he could talk to us. And I think you need to be very sensitive to the needs of your spouse or partner or whatever if they have this high stress job. They need to relax when they come home. They need to have a good nourishing meal. And then you tell them what's wrong, you know, okay? Then you say, oh, this needs fixing, or how are we going to do this? But to come home from a high stress job and then pile that on to somebody is very unfair, you know. So I think we need to be very aware of stress, what puts people under stress, and the need to decompress from stress. And of course, caffeine is, you're under constant stress when you when you take caffeine. Have I convinced you? What? Well, the kombucha, it's theobromine in the tea. That's neutralized by the fermentation. And I know it's neutralized because I'm very sensitive to caffeine. A sip of coffee will keep me awake all night, but kombucha doesn't. So. Pardon me? Dark chocolate. Okay, so dark chocolate's going to give you a lift. What chocolate does is normalize dopamine. It brings up your dopamine. So if you're feeling a little down, a little depressed, it'll bring it up. For people with high dopamine, chocolate is like, it'll put them off the wall. And some people, chocolate sends into a rage. You go on the internet and just put in chocolate rage, and you'll see what I'm saying. So it does have psychotropic effects, and I know that chocolate is addictive. It's hard to get off, but if you want to, what I would suggest is do lots of broth-based soups, broth-based sauces, because that is a really good way of normalizing dopamine without chocolate. Yes?
Is there like some small benefit in alcohol and like moderation? The fact that so many people like, a little bit of it.
Yeah, I don't have any objection to that. I think it helps a lot of people. If you can be moderate. A lot of people can't be moderate. If you can't be moderate, I think the best thing is kombucha. It's helped so many alcoholics get off alcohol because it's something that just really tastes great, and it gives you a lift by feeding your body, feeding your microorganisms. Alcohol? Yeah, it relaxes you, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, yes, I agree with you. You want sour kombucha. It should be like alcohol. Like vinegar. Ooh, that was a Freudian slip. Yes. Now, we make our own kombucha. We brew it for 10 days, and then we leave it in the bottle for 2 weeks before we put it in the fridge. Yeah, so we really let it ferment a long time. And it's sour. It's sour as vinegar. Yeah. I don't know why I have this twice, but here's why I have it twice, because what does caffeine do? It puts you back on that blood sugar roller coaster again. And that's just so bad for your adrenal glands. And when your adrenals are shot, everything is affected in your body. One of the things that happens when your adrenals are shot is you're much more prone to injury, especially of the ligaments. You get torn ligaments real easily. This was in a book called Caffeine. So the first spider web is a spider on marijuana, then benzodrine, then chloral hydrate, and then caffeine. So the most chaotic web was the spider on caffeine. I don't recommend any of these things. I think with a good diet, with plenty of fats, you make all these feel-good chemicals yourself, and you don't need any of these stimulants or drugs. Anyone get the satirical paper, The Onion? It used to be a lot better until it got sold. It was really funny paper. Brain forced to run entire body on muffin and frappuccino. My husband and I used to live in town in Washington, and there was a Starbucks right down the street, and you'd go out in the morning, and you'd see this long line into Starbucks, and they were coming out with the big coffee and a muffin. What's muffin? It's just cake. And the cell phones, and the girls in high heels. Oh, this is a recipe for burnout. So instead of junk food based on sugar and white flour and trans fats, just eat real food. Eggs, meat, cheese, pate, liverwurst, even nuts is a great food. Instead of caffeine beverages, whole raw milk, broth-based soups, kombucha, and other lacto-fermented beverages. There are other things that you can drink that are helpful in getting off the caffeine. So here we are, alternatives to coffee, raw milk, kombucha, hot bone broth. Here's what I like if I'm feeling sleepy, when I do get sleepy sometimes. If I can take a nap, I will, a little power nap. But I put some molasses, like 2 tablespoons of molasses in a mug, some coconut oil, and a little teaspoon or half a teaspoon of powdered ginger. And I add hot water to that. And I drink that like coffee. It's fantastic. It really perks you up. It's good for your digestion. It's dark like coffee. You could add cream if you want. You could add butter if you want. Okay, if somebody asks me about supplements, here's what I take. I'm not saying everybody needs to take this. I take cod liver oil every day, and I take a little butter oil with the cod liver oil. I'm hesitant to recommend butter oil because it is quite expensive. But when that butter oil first came out, and this was about 15 years ago, I was very worried about a health problem that was developing. I felt very stiff when I woke up in the morning, especially my hands, very stiff. And I thought, oh dear, I'm getting arthritis. 2 weeks on that butter oil, and that stiffness went away and has never come back. And that's exactly what Dr. Price said, that this, what's in the butter oil would be good for your joints. So, yes, so the butter oil, they take the high vitamin butter and it goes in a centrifuge. And you end up with an oil and a kind of hard wax, very hard. And the nutrients concentrate in the oil. The arachidonic acid concentrates in the oil. I guess so. But it sure helped me, yeah. Yes, I take a teaspoon of cod liver oil and a quarter of a teaspoon of butter oil. It's very small. I take B12, and the reason I take B12 is because I've come from a family where there's a lot of signs of B12 deficiency. It's kind of one of those genius families where you have a lot of mental instability also. You know what I mean. So and I've seen this in members of my family, and I just don't want to be that way myself. So I do take B12. I take 1. It's a sublingual. And I also take vitamin C. Now, I don't think everyone has to take vitamin C. This is a very natural vitamin C. It's low potency. It's just a powdered fruit, actually. But because I suffered from allergies so much as a young woman, I find that vitamin C really helps that. And vitamin C is very important for your adrenal glands also. So I know I had shot adrenal glands at the age of 25. So this is the Green Pastures fermented cod liver oil and butter oil. It's the Jarrow B12, and it's the Amla C. I don't know what the brand is. It's Pure Planet on it. Boron. So a couple of years ago, I didn't have this arthritis thing, but I had a very stiff, painful knee. And I thought, oh dear. Now see, when you're in the health food field, you can't have any health problems. And I thought, oh dear, what's going to happen if I have to have an operation on my knee? And how am I going to explain this to people? Well, I read an article by a guy in Australia about boron. And I started using this. I put a teaspoon of boron in a quart of water. You have to be careful with boron because too much is toxic. And then you take about a tablespoon of that per day mixed with more water. 2 weeks of that, and my knee I've never had a problem since. I can carry heavy things up and down the stairs. It's just gone. Just gone. So I really recommend this if you're having this kind of problem. I do it every day. Yeah. Once I was giving this talk and somebody raised her hand, she said, "We do this on our horses," and it keeps them limber. On the internet, yeah, just it's boron powder or borax powder, whatever. You can use that. Mm-hmm. Borax has sodium with it, but it can be boron powder or borax, either one. So, oh, it kills ants. That's why you have to be careful, not to use too much. So exercise. People say, "How come you guys don't stress exercise more?" Well, we're not against exercise. It's best done out of doors, in the fresh air, and don't overdo. Traditional cultures did not overdo exercise. They did a lot of sitting around. So I think we have people putting themselves on punishing exercise regimes. It's very depleting, very stressful for your adrenal glands. It's much better to do a weekly game of tennis, a very pleasant game of tennis with your friends in the open air, than to go to the gym every day and wear yourself out. And you need to be careful of repetitive exercises. Some of the most common injuries happen on these treadmill machines and stationary bikes and things. Because when traditional people didn't use those. Their exercising gave them a lot of different types of movements, not the same movement over and over. Now, this comes from my husband. He says, "You have to have a goal." He says, "If you don't have a goal, you might as well be in the box with the long screws." He turned 90 recently, and he woke up the next day. He said, "I still have goals. I'm going to live to 100. And this has nothing to do with health or eating. Something else. Not that I'm going to give up coffee or whatever it is, but something else. I'm going to do this. I'm going to take this trip. I'm going to clean out my closet. Whatever it is, have a goal. Write it down. Put it on your refrigerator. Have goals. It keeps you from dwelling on yourself, and it keeps you looking to the future. And that's very important. And balance is very important. And we see imbalance a lot in this field. We see people who are just totally focused on food. And that's not right. Totally focused on exercise. Totally focused on having an absolutely perfect diet, and never eating a smidgen of sugar. And I think it's a big temptation, and we need to learn to be kind of relaxed about this. So we want a balance between materialism and mysticism. Some people are very materialistic. There's nothing having to do with the spiritual world, and some people just want to be in the spiritual world and have nothing to do with real life and work and all the things we have to do. Between restraint and spontaneity. People who are always exercising a lot of willpower and restraining themselves, they're really unpleasant people to be with. You want spontaneity. You want both. You need a balance between both. Between being strict and being lenient with yourself and your children and your spouse, and there's a happy medium. Between play and work. We need to play, but we need to work. It's very important to be serious about your work, but it's also important to play. Between prudishness and lust, okay? That's an important balance that we need to achieve with your sex life. It's got to be somewhere in the middle. Between justice and mercy. Now, that's more of the whole society. Unfortunately, we're way over in the justice side. And we're putting people in jail for 45 years for minuscule crimes. And where's the mercy gone? It's just kind of disappeared. We really need to get back to that center. Between renunciation and excess. I'm not into renunciation at all. I don't like renunciation. But you don't want to have excess either. So learning to have that balance, that's a really key skill to gain in life. And it requires a lot of thought, which is important, a lot of wisdom. And of course that needs to then be manifested in everything you do in life. So we are not primitive people. Primitive people had more of a group soul consciousness. They absolutely had no choice in the foods they ate. They just ate what was there. And they knew instinctively what to eat. They had good health without any individual effort. It was just there. It was part of the environment. It was this gift to the whole tribe or the whole village. And we have lost that. We don't have that group soul consciousness. We have progressed to a state of individual consciousness. We've lost our instinctive knowledge, and we also have many food choices and temptations. So the goal is to get back to the good health of the primitive people, but in full freedom, choosing the right foods with the mind and the emotions. In other words, to eat what we're supposed to eat, but to want to eat that at the same time, not to be some kind of struggle. I know I should eat this, but I want to eat something else, see. That is the real goal, to have that primitive diet, but with a totally different type of consciousness, with the individual consciousness and not the group consciousness. And that's a real accomplishment. And once you learn to do that with your food, you can do that with everything else in life. You know, you can make the right decisions, and they're coming from the head and the heart at the same time, and they're not warring with each other. That was what in esoteric circles was called the alchemical marriage, the perfect marriage between the soul and the mind, between the emotions and the mind. And finally, be a member. I hope you've all signed up today. Be a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. Support the work we do. It's only $40 a year, although we give you lots of opportunities throughout the year to give a little more. But please be a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. We are a membership organization. We can't do it without you. And the more members we have, the more that we can do. So visit our table, pick up the brochures, get our shopping guide. You'll get a shopping guide if you're a member. Spend some time on our website. And finally, our summary again. Everything they did in traditional diets increased the digestibility, increased the nutrient density of the foods. They knew how to do this instinctively. We now have to do it in full individual consciousness. But there's no other way. Modern medicine, I'm not dissing modern medicine. There's a lot of good things about modern medicine, but it won't give us health. Just keeps us alive while we're looking for health, so to speak. So, same with all these other modalities. They all have their place. They can all help us, but none of these is a substitute for giving our body, our physical body, what it needs, nutrient-dense foods. So thank you very much. You've been a great audience.